Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring cosmic horror by other authors than Lovecraft. Volume 1. The Hounds of Tindalos by Frank Belknap Long. Dig Me No Grave by Robert E. Howard. The Curse of Yig by Zealia Brown Reed. The Secret of Kralitz by Henry Kuttner. The Tree of Life by C. L. Moore. The Hounds of Tindalos by Frank Belknap Long, Jr. Originally published in Weird Tales, March 1929. Narrated by Tom Trussel. 1. "I'm glad you came," said Chalmers. He was sitting by the window, and his face was very pale. 2 tall candles guttered at his elbow and cast a sickly amber light over his long nose and slightly receding chin. Chalmers would have nothing modern about his apartment. He had the soul of a medieval ascetic, and he preferred illuminated manuscripts to automobiles and leering stone gargoyles to radios and adding machines. As I crossed the room to the settee he had cleared for me, I glanced at his desk and was surprised to discover that he had been studying the mathematical formulae of a celebrated contemporary physicist, and that he had covered many sheets of thin yellow paper with curious geometric designs. "Einstein and John Dee are strange bedfellows," I said as my gaze wandered from his mathematical charts to the 60 or 70 quaint books that comprised his strange little library. Plotinus and Emmanuel Moschopoulos, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Frenicle de Bessy stood elbow to elbow in the sombre ebony bookcase, and chairs, table, and desk were littered with pamphlets about medieval sorcery and witchcraft and black magic, and all of the valiant glamorous things that the modern world had repudiated. Chalmers smiled engagingly and passed me a Russian cigarette on a curiously carved tray. "We are just discovering now," he said, "that the old alchemists and sorcerers were 2/3 right, and that your modern biologist and materialist is 9/10 wrong." "You have always scoffed at modern science," I said, a little impatiently. "Only at scientific dogmatism," he replied. "I have always been a rebel, a champion of originality and lost causes. That is why I have chosen to repudiate the conclusions of contemporary biologists." "And Einstein?" I asked. "A priest of transcendental mathematics," he murmured reverently, "a profound mystic, an explorer of the great suspected." "Then you do not entirely despise science?" "Of course not," he affirmed. "I merely distrust the scientific positivism of the past 50 years, the positivism of Haeckel and Darwin and of Mr. Bertrand Russell. I believe that biology has failed pitifully to explain the mystery of man's origin and destiny." "Give them time," I retorted. Chalmers' eyes glowed. "My friend," he murmured, "your pun is sublime. Give them time. That is precisely what I would do. But your modern biologist scoffs at time. He has the key, but he refuses to use it. What do we know of time, really? Einstein believes that it is relative, that it can be interpreted in terms of space, of curved space. But must we stop there? When mathematics fails us, can we not advance by insight?" You are treading on dangerous ground, I replied. That is a pitfall that your true investigator avoids. That is why modern science has advanced so slowly. It accepts nothing that it cannot demonstrate. But I would take hashish, opium, all manner of drugs. I would emulate the sages of the East. And then perhaps I would apprehend— What? The fourth dimension. Theosophical rubbish. Perhaps. But I believe that drugs expand human consciousness. William James agreed with me, and I have discovered a new one. A new drug? It was used centuries ago by Chinese alchemists, but it is virtually unknown in the West. Its occult properties are amazing. With its aid, and the aid of my mathematical knowledge, I believe that I can go back through time. I do not understand. Time is merely our imperfect perception of a new dimension of space. Time and motion are both illusions. Everything that has existed from the beginning of the world exists now. Events that occurred centuries ago on this planet continue to exist in another dimension of space. Events that will occur centuries from now exist already. We cannot perceive their existence because we cannot enter the dimension of space that contains them. Human beings as we know them are merely fractions, infinitesimally small fractions of one enormous whole. Every human being is linked with all the life that has preceded him on this planet. All of his ancestors are parts of him. Only time separates him from his forebears, and time is an illusion and does not exist. I think I understand, I murmured. It will be sufficient for my purpose if you can form a vague idea of what I wish to achieve. I wish to strip from my eyes the veils of illusion that time has thrown over them, and see the beginning and the end. And you think this new drug will help you? I'm sure that it will, and I want you to help me. I intend to take the drug immediately. I cannot wait. I must see. His eyes glittered strangely. I am going back through time. He rose and strode to the mantel. When he faced me again, he was holding a small square box in the palm of his hand. I have here 5 pellets of the drug, Liao. It was used by the Chinese philosopher Lao Tse, and while under its influence, he visioned Tao. Tao is the most mysterious force in the world. It surrounds and pervades all things. It contains the visible universe and everything that we call reality. He who apprehends the mysteries of Tao sees clearly all that was and will be. Rubbish, I retorted. Tao resembles a great animal, recumbent, motionless, containing in its enormous body all the worlds of our universe, the past, the present, and the future. We see portions of this great monster through a slit, which we call time. With the aid of this drug, I shall enlarge the slit. I shall behold the great figure of life, the great recumbent beast in its entirety. And what do you wish me to do? Watch, my friend. Watch and take notes. And if I go back too far, you must recall me to reality. You can recall me by shaking me violently. If I appear to be suffering acute physical pain, you must recall me at once. Chalmers, I said, I wish you wouldn't make this experiment. You are taking dreadful risks. I don't believe that there is any 4th dimension, and I emphatically do not believe in Tao. And I don't approve of your experimenting with unknown drugs. I know the properties of this drug, he replied. I know precisely how it affects the human animal, and I know its dangers. The risk does not reside in the drug itself. My only fear is that I may become lost in time. You see, I shall assist the drug. Before I swallow this pellet, I shall give my undivided attention to the geometric and algebraic symbols that I have traced on this paper. He raised the mathematical chart that rested on his knee. I shall prepare my mind for an excursion into time. I shall approach the fourth dimension with my conscious mind before I take the drug which will enable me to exercise occult powers of perception. Before I enter the dream world of the Eastern mystics, I shall acquire all of the mathematical help that modern science can offer. This mathematical knowledge, this conscious approach to an actual apprehension of the fourth dimension of time, will supplement the work of the drug. The drug will open up stupendous new vistas. The mathematical preparation will enable me to grasp them intellectually. I have often grasped the fourth dimension in dreams, emotionally, intuitively, but I have never been able to recall, in waking life, the occult splendors that were momentarily revealed to me. But with your aid, I believe that I can recall them. You will take down everything that I say while I am under the influence of the drug. No matter how strange or incoherent my speech may become, you will omit nothing. When I awake, I may be able to supply the key to whatever is mysterious or incredible. I am not sure that I shall succeed. But if I do succeed, his eyes were strangely luminous, time will exist for me no longer. He sat down abruptly. I shall make the experiment at once. Please stand over there by the window and watch. Have you a fountain pen? I nodded gloomily and removed a pale green waterman from my upper vest pocket. And a pad, Frank? I groaned and produced a memorandum book. I emphatically disapprove of this experiment, I muttered. You're taking a frightful risk. Don't be an asinine old woman, he admonished. Nothing that you can say will induce me to stop now. I entreat you to remain silent while I study these charts. He raised the charts and studied them intently. I watched the clock on the mantel as it ticked out the seconds, and a curious dread clutched at my heart so that I choked. Suddenly the clock stopped ticking, and exactly at that moment Chalmers swallowed the drug. I rose quickly and moved toward him, but his eyes implored me not to interfere. "The clock has stopped," he murmured. "The forces that control it approve of my experiment. Time stopped, and I swallowed the drug. I pray God that I shall not lose my way." He closed his eyes and leaned back on the sofa. All of the blood had left his face, and he was breathing heavily. It was clear that the drug was acting with extraordinary rapidity. "It is beginning to get dark," he murmured. "Write that. It is beginning to get dark, and the familiar objects in the room are fading out. I can discern them vaguely through my eyelids, but they are fading swiftly." I shook my pen to make the ink come, and wrote rapidly in shorthand as he continued to dictate. "I am leaving the room. The walls are vanishing, and I can no longer see any of the familiar objects. Your face, though, is still visible to me. I hope that you are writing. I think that I am about to make a great leap, a leap through space. Or perhaps it is through time that I shall make the leap. I cannot tell. Everything is dark, indistinct." He sat for a while, silent, with his head sunk upon his breast. Then suddenly he stiffened, and his eyelids fluttered open. "God in heaven!" he cried. "I see!" He was straining forward in his chair, staring at the opposite wall. But I knew that he was looking beyond the wall, and that the objects in the room no longer existed for him. "Chalmers!" I cried. "Chalmers, shall I wake you?" "Do not!" he shrieked. I see everything. All of the billions of lives that preceded me on this planet are before me at this moment. I see men of all ages, all races, all colors. They are fighting, killing, building, dancing, singing. They are sitting about rude fires on lonely grey deserts, and flying through the air in monoplanes. They are riding the seas in bark canoes and enormous steamships. They are painting bison and mammoths on the walls of dismal caves and covering huge canvases with queer futuristic designs. I watch the migrations from Atlantis. I watch the migrations from Lemuria. I see the elder races, a strange horde of black dwarfs overwhelming Asia, and the Neanderthalers with lowered heads and bent knees ranging obscenely across Europe. I watch the Archaeans streaming into the Greek islands and the crude beginnings of Hellenic culture. I am in Athens, and Pericles is young. I am standing on the soil of Italy. I assist in the rape of the Sabines. I march with the imperial legions. I tremble with awe and wonder as the enormous standards go by and the ground shakes with the tread of the victorious Hastati. 1,000 naked slaves grovel before me as I pass in a litter of gold and ivory drawn by night-black oxen from Thebes, and the flower girls scream, "Ave Caesar," as I nod and smile. I am myself a slave on a Moorish galley. I watch the erection of a great cathedral. Stone by stone it rises, and through months and years I stand and watch each stone as it falls into place. I am burned on a cross head downward in the thyme-scented gardens of Nero, and I watch with amusement and scorn the torturers at work in the chambers of the Inquisition. I walk in the holiest sanctuaries. I enter the temples of Venus. I kneel in adoration before the Magna Mater. I throw coins on the bare knees of the sacred courtesans who sit with veiled faces in the groves of Babylon. I creep into an Elizabethan theatre, and with the stinking rabble about me I applaud the Merchant of Venice. I walk with Dante through the narrow streets of Florence. I meet the young Beatrice, and the hem of her garment brushes my sandals as I stare enraptured. I am a priest of Isis, and my magic astounds the nations. Simon Magus kneels before me, imploring my assistance, and Pharaoh trembles when I approach. In India I talk with the masters and run screaming from their presence, for their revelations are as salt on wounds that bleed. I perceive everything simultaneously. I perceive everything from all sides. I am a part of all the teeming billions about me. I exist in all men, and all men exist in me. I perceive the whole of human history in a single instant, the past and the present. By simply straining, I can see farther and farther back. Now I am going back through strange curves and angles. Angles and curves multiply about me. I perceive great segments of time through curves. There is curved time and angular time. The beings that exist in angular time cannot enter curved time. It is very strange. I am going back and back. Man has disappeared from the earth. Gigantic reptiles crouch beneath enormous palms and swim through the loathly black waters of dismal lakes. Now the reptiles have disappeared. No animals remain upon the land, but beneath the waters, plainly visible to me, dark forms move slowly over the rotting vegetation. The forms are becoming simpler and simpler. Now they are single cells. All about me there are angles, strange angles that have no counterparts on the earth. I am desperately afraid. There is an abyss of being which man has never fathomed. I stared. Chalmers had risen to his feet, and he was gesticulating helplessly with his arms. I am passing through unearthly angles. I am approaching. Oh, the burning horror of it! "Chalmers," I cried, "do you wish me to interfere?" He brought his right hand quickly before his face, as though to shut out a vision unspeakable. "Not yet," he cried. "I will go on. I will see what lies beyond." A cold sweat streamed from his forehead, and his shoulders jerked spasmodically. "Beyond life there are—" His face grew ashen with terror. "Things that I cannot distinguish. They move slowly through angles. They have no bodies, and they move slowly through outrageous angles." It was then that I became aware of the odour in the room. It was a pungent, indescribable odour, so nauseous that I could scarcely endure it. I stepped quickly to the window and threw it open. When I returned to Chalmers and looked into his eyes, I nearly fainted. "I think they have scented me," he shrieked. "They are slowly turning toward me." He was trembling horribly. For a moment he clawed at the air with his hands. Then his legs gave way beneath him, and he fell forward on his face, slobbering and moaning. I watched him in silence as he dragged himself across the floor. He was no longer a man. His teeth were bared, and saliva dripped from the corners of his mouth. "Chalmers!" I cried. "Chalmers! Stop it! Stop it, do you hear?" As if in reply to my appeal, he commenced to utter hoarse, convulsive sounds which resembled nothing so much as the barking of a dog, and began a sort of hideous writhing in a circle about the room. I bent and seized him by the shoulders. Violently, desperately, I shook him. He turned his head and snapped at my wrist. I was sick with horror, but I dared not release him for fear that he would destroy himself in a paroxysm of rage. "Chalmers," I muttered, "you must stop that. There's nothing in this room that can harm you. Do you understand?" I continued to shake and admonish him, and gradually the madness died out of his face. Shivering convulsively, he crumpled into a grotesque heap on the Chinese rug. I carried him to the sofa and deposited him upon it. His features were twisted in pain, and I knew that he was still struggling dumbly to escape from abominable memories. "Whiskey," he muttered. "You'll find a flask in the cabinet by the window, upper left-hand drawer." When I handed him the flask, his fingers tightened about it until the knuckles showed blue. "They nearly got me," he gasped. He drained the stimulant in immoderate gulps, and gradually the colour crept back into his face. "That drug was the very devil," I murmured. "It wasn't the drug," he moaned. His eyes no longer glared insanely, but he still wore the look of a lost soul. "They scented me in time," he moaned. "I went too far." "What were they like?" I said, to humour him. He leaned forward and gripped my arm. He was shivering horribly. "No word in our language can describe them," he spoke in a hoarse whisper. "They're symbolized vaguely in the myth of the fall, and in an obscene form which is occasionally found engraven on ancient tablets. The Greeks had a name for them, which veiled their essential foulness. The tree, the snake, and the apple. These are the vague symbols of a most awful mystery." His voice had risen to a scream. "Frank! Frank! A terrible and unspeakable deed was done in the beginning. Before time, the deed, and from the deed." He had risen and was hysterically pacing the room. "The seeds of the deed move through angles in dim recesses of time. They are hungry and athirst." "Chalmers," I pleaded to quiet him. "We are living in the 3rd decade of the 20th century." "They are lean and athirst," he shrieked. "The Hounds of Tindalos." "Chalmers, shall I phone for a physician?" "A physician cannot help me now. They are horrors of the soul, and yet—" He hid his face in his hands and groaned. "They are real, Frank. I saw them for a ghastly moment. For a moment I stood on the other side. I stood on the pale grey shores beyond time and space, in an awful light that was not light, in a silence that shrieked. I saw them. All the evil in the universe was concentrated in their lean, hungry bodies. Or had they bodies? I saw them only for a moment. I cannot be certain. But I heard them breathe. Indescribably for a moment, I felt their breath upon my face. They turned toward me, and I fled screaming. In a single moment I fled screaming through time. I fled down quintillions of years. But they scented me. Men awaken them cosmic hungers. We have escaped, momentarily, from the foulness that rings them around. They thirst for that in us which is clean, which emerged from the deed without stain. There is a part of us which did not partake in the deed, and that they hate. But do not imagine that they are literally, prosaically evil. They are beyond good and evil as we know it. They are that which in the beginning fell away from cleanliness. Through the deed they became bodies of death, receptacles of all foulness. But they are not evil in our sense, because in the spheres through which they move there is no thought, no morals, no right or wrong as we understand it. There is merely the pure and the foul. The foul expresses itself through angles, the pure through curves. Man, the pure part of him, is descended from a curve. Do not laugh. I mean that literally. I rose and searched for my hat. I'm dreadfully sorry for you, Chalmers, I said as I walked toward the door, but I don't intend to stay and listen to such gibberish. I'll send my physicians to see you. He is an elderly, kindly chap, and he won't be offended if you tell him to go to the devil. But I hope you'll respect his advice. A week's rest at a good sanitarium should benefit you immeasurably. I heard him laughing as I descended the stairs, but his laughter was so utterly mirthless that it moved me to tears. 2. When Chalmers phoned the following morning, my first impulse was to hang up the receiver immediately. His request was so unusual, and his voice was so wildly hysterical, that I feared any further association with him would result in the impairment of my own sanity. But I could not doubt the genuineness of his misery, and when he broke down completely, and I heard him sobbing over the wire, I decided to comply with his request. "Very well," I said. "I will come over immediately and bring the plaster." En route to Chalmers' home, I stopped at a hardware store and purchased 20 pounds of plaster of Paris. When I entered my friend's room, he was crouching by the window watching the opposite wall out of eyes that were feverish with fright. When he saw me, he rose and seized the parcel containing the plaster with an avidity that amazed and horrified me. He had extruded all of the furniture, and the room presented a desolate appearance. "It is just conceivable that we can thwart them," he exclaimed, "but we must work rapidly. Frank, there is a step-ladder in the hall. Bring it here immediately, and then fetch a pail of water." "What for?" I murmured. He turned sharply, and there was a flush on his face. "To mix the plaster, you fool!" he cried. "To mix the plaster that will save our bodies and souls from a contamination unmentionable. To mix the plaster that will save the world from... Frank, they must be kept out." "Who?" I murmured. "The Hounds of Tindalos," he muttered. "They can only reach us through angles. We must eliminate all angles from this room. I shall plaster up all the corners, all of the crevices. We must make this room resemble the interior of a sphere." I knew that it would have been useless to argue with him. I fetched the step-ladder, Chalmers mixed the plaster, and for 3 hours we laboured. We filled in the 4 corners of the wall, and the intersections of the floor and the wall and ceiling, and we rounded the sharp angles of the window seat. "I shall remain in this room until they return in time," he affirmed when our task was completed. "When they discover that the scent leads through curves, they will return. They will return ravenous and snarling and unsatisfied to the foulness that was in the beginning, before time, beyond space." He nodded graciously and lit a cigarette. "It was good of you to help," he said. "Will you not see a physician, Chalmers?" I pleaded. "Perhaps tomorrow," he murmured. "But now I must watch and wait." "Wait for what?" I urged. Chalmers smiled wanly. "I know that you think me insane," he said. "You have a shrewd but prosaic mind, and you cannot conceive of an entity that does not depend for its existence on force and matter. But did it ever occur to you, my friend, that force and matter are merely the barriers to perception imposed by time and space? When one knows, as I do, that time and space are identical, and that they are both deceptive because they are merely imperfect manifestations of a higher reality, one no longer seeks in the visible world for an explanation of the mystery and terror of being." I rose and walked toward the door. "Forgive me," he cried. "I did not mean to offend you. You have a superlative intellect, but I have a superhuman one. It is only natural that I should be aware of your limitations." "Phone if you need me," I said, and descended the stairs 2 steps at a time. "I'll send my physician over at once," I muttered to myself. "He's a hopeless maniac, and heaven knows what will happen if someone doesn't take charge of him immediately." 3. The following is a condensation of 2 announcements which appeared in the Partridgeville Gazette for July the 3rd, 1928. Earthquake shakes financial district. At 2 o'clock this morning, an earth tremor of unusual severity broke several plate-glass windows in Central Square and completely disorganized the electric and street railway systems. The tremor was felt in the outlying districts, and the steeple of the First Baptist Church on Angell Hill, designed by Christopher Wren in 1717, was entirely demolished. Firemen are now attempting to put out a blaze which threatens to destroy the Partridgeville glue works. An investigation is promised by the mayor, and an immediate attempt will be made to fix responsibility for this disastrous occurrence. Occult writer murdered by unknown guest. Horrible crime in Central Square. Mystery surrounds death of Halpin Chalmers. At 9 a.m. today, the body of Halpin Chalmers, author and journalist, was found in an empty room above the jewelry store of Smithick and Isaacs, 24 Central Square. The coroner's investigation revealed that the room had been rented furnished to Mr. Chalmers on May the 1st, and that he had himself disposed of the furniture a fortnight ago. Chalmers was the author of several recondite books on occult themes, and a member of the Bibliographic Guild. He formerly resided in Brooklyn, New York. At 7 a.m., Mr. L. E. Hancock, who occupies the apartment opposite Chalmers's room in the Smithick and Isaacs establishment, smelt a peculiar odour when he opened his door to take in his cat and the morning edition of the Partridgeville Gazette. The odour he describes as extremely acrid and nauseous, and he affirms that it was so strong in the vicinity of Chalmers's room that he was obliged to hold his nose when he approached that section of the hall. He was about to return to his own apartment when it occurred to him that Chalmers might have accidentally forgotten to turn off the gas in his kitchenette. Becoming considerably alarmed at the thought, he decided to investigate, and when repeated tappings on Chalmers's door brought no response, he notified the superintendent. The latter opened the door by means of a pass-key, and the 2 men quickly made their way into Chalmers's room. The room was utterly destitute of furniture, and Hancock asserts that when he first glanced at the floor, his heart went cold within him, and that the superintendent, without saying a word, walked to the open window and stared at the building opposite for fully 5 minutes. Chalmers lay stretched upon his back in the centre of the room. He was starkly nude, and his chest and arms were covered with a peculiar bluish pus or ichor. His head lay grotesquely upon his chest. It had been completely severed from his body, and the features were twisted and torn and horribly mangled. Nowhere was there a trace of blood. The room presented a most astonishing appearance. The intersections of the walls, ceiling, and floor had been thickly smeared with plaster of Paris, but at intervals fragments had cracked and fallen off, and someone had grouped these upon the floor about the murdered man so as to form a perfect triangle. Beside the body were several sheets of charred yellow paper. These bore fantastic geometric designs and symbols and several hastily scrawled sentences. The sentences were almost illegible and so absurd in context that they furnished no possible clue to the perpetrator of the crime. "I am waiting and watching," Chalmers wrote. "I sit by the window and watch walls and ceiling. I do not believe they can reach me, but I must beware of the duels. Perhaps they can help them break through. The satyrs will help, and they can advance through the scarlet circles. The Greeks knew a way of preventing that. It is a great pity that we have forgotten so much." On another sheet of paper, the most badly charred of the 7 or 8 fragments found by Detective Sergeant Douglas of the Partridge Rail Reserve was scrawled the following: "Good God! The plaster is falling. A terrific shock has loosened the plaster, and it is falling. An earthquake, perhaps. I never could have anticipated this. It is growing dark in the room. I must phone Frank. But can he get here in time? I will try. I will recite the Einstein formula. I will. God, they are breaking through. They are breaking through. Smoke is pouring from the corners of the wall. Their tongues! Ah!" In the opinion of Detective Sergeant Douglas, Chalmers was poisoned by some obscure chemical. He has sent specimens of the strange blue slime found on Chalmers's body to the Partridgeville Chemical Laboratories, and he expects the report will shed new light on one of the most mysterious crimes of recent years. That Chalmers entertained a guest on the evening preceding the earthquake is certain, for his neighbour distinctly heard a low murmur of conversation in the former's room as he passed it on his way to the stairs. Suspicion points strongly to this unknown visitor, and the police are diligently endeavouring to discover his identity. 4. Report of James Morton, chemist and bacteriologist. My dear Mr. Douglas, the fluid sent to me for analysis is the most peculiar that I have ever examined. It resembles living protoplasm, but it lacks the peculiar substances known as enzymes. Enzymes catalyze the chemical reactions occurring in living cells, and when the cell dies, they cause it to disintegrate by hydrolyzation. Without enzymes, protoplasm should possess enduring vitality, i.e., immortality. Enzymes are the negative components, so to speak, of unicellular organism, which is the basis of all life. That living matter can exist without enzymes, biologists emphatically deny. And yet, the substance that you have sent me is alive, and it lacks these indispensable bodies. Good God, sir, do you realize what astounding new vistas this opens up? 5. Excerpt from The Secret Watchers by the late Halpin Chalmers. What if, parallel to the life we know, there is another life that does not die, which lacks the element that destroys our life? Perhaps in another dimension there is a different force from that which generates our life. Perhaps this force emits energy, or something similar to energy, which passes from the unknown dimension where it is, and creates a new form of cell life in our dimension. No one knows that such new cell life does exist in our dimension. Ah, but I have seen its manifestations. I have talked with them. In my room at night I have talked with the Doels, and in dreams I have seen their marker. I have stood on the dim shore beyond time and matter and seen it. It moves through strange curves and outrageous angles. Some day I shall travel in time and meet it face to face.
The end. Subscribe for more at storiesoffuturespast.substack.com. And now for the next story.
Dig Me No Grave by Robert E. Howard. Originally published in Weird Tales, February 1937. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The thunder of my old-fashioned door-knocker, reverberating eerily through the house, roused me from a restless and nightmare-haunted sleep. I looked out the window. In the last light of the sinking moon, the white face of my friend John Conrad looked up at me. "May I come up, Kirwan?" His voice was shaky and strained. "Certainly." I sprang out of bed and pulled on a bathrobe as I heard him enter the front door and ascend the stairs. A moment later he stood before me, and in the light which I had turned on I saw his hands tremble and noticed the unnatural pallor of his face. "Old John Grimland died an hour ago," he said abruptly. "Indeed? I had not known that he was ill." "It was a sudden virulent attack of peculiar nature, a sort of seizure somewhat akin to epilepsy. He has been subject to such spells of late years, you know." I nodded. I knew something of the old hermit-like man who had lived in his great dark house on the hill. Indeed, I had once witnessed one of his strange seizures, and I had been appalled at the writhings, howlings, and yammerings of the wretch, who had grovelled on the earth like a wounded snake, gibbering terrible curses and black blasphemies until his voice broke in a wordless screaming which spattered his lips with foam. Seeing this, I understood why people in old times looked on such victims as men possessed by demons. "Some hereditary taint," Conrad was saying. "Old John doubtless fell heir to some ingrown weakness brought on by some loathsome disease, which was his heritage from perhaps a remote ancestor. Such things occasionally happen. Or else, well, you know old John himself pried about in the mysterious parts of the earth, and wandered all over the East in his younger days. It is quite possible that he was infected with some obscure malady in his wanderings. There are still many unclassified diseases in Africa and the Orient." "But," said I, "you have not told me the reason for this sudden visit at this unearthly hour, for I notice that it is past midnight." My friend seemed rather confused. "Well, the fact is that John Grimland died alone, except for myself. He refused to receive any medical aid of any sort, and in the last few moments when it was evident that he was dying, and I was prepared to go for some sort of help in spite of him, he set up such a howling and screaming that I could not refuse his passionate pleas, which were that he should not be left to die alone." "I have seen men die," added Conrad, wiping the perspiration from his pale brow. "But the death of John Grimland was the most fearful I have ever seen." "He suffered a great deal?" "He appeared to be in much physical agony, but this was mostly submerged by some monstrous mental or psychic suffering. The fear in his distended eyes and his screams transcended any conceivable earthly terror. I tell you, Kirwan, Grimland's fright was greater and deeper than the ordinary fear of the beyond shown by a man of ordinary evil life." I shifted restlessly. The dark implications of this statement sent a chill of nameless apprehension trickling down my spine. I know the country people always claimed that in his youth he sold his soul to the devil, and that his sudden epileptic attacks were merely a visible sign of the fiend's power over him. But such talk is foolish, of course, and belongs in the Dark Ages. We all know that John Grimland's life was a peculiarly evil and vicious one, even toward his last days. With good reason he was universally detested and feared, for I never heard of his doing a single good act. You were his only friend. And that was a strange friendship, said Conrad. I was attracted to him by his unusual powers, for despite his bestial nature, John Grimland was a highly educated man, a deeply cultured man. He had dipped deep into occult studies, and I first met him in this manner, for as you know, I have always been strongly interested in these lines of research myself. But in this, as in all other things, Grimland was evil and perverse. He had ignored the white side of the occult, and delved into the darker, grimmer phases of it, into devil worship and voodoo and Shintoism. His knowledge of these foul arts and sciences was immense and unholy, and to hear him tell of his researches and experiments was to know such horror and repulsion as a venomous reptile might inspire. For there had been no depths to which he had not sunk, and some things he only hinted at, even to me. I'll tell you, Kirwan, it is easy to laugh at tales of the black world of the unknown, when one is in pleasant company under the bright sunlight. But had you sat at ungodly hours in the silent bizarre library of John Grimland, and looked on the ancient musty volumes and listened to his grisly talk as I did, your tongue would have cloven to your palate with sheer horror as mine did, and the supernatural would have seemed very real and near to you, as it seemed to me. "But in God's name, man," I cried, for the tension was growing unbearable, "come to the point and tell me what you want of me." "I want you to come with me to John Grimland's house and help carry out his outlandish instructions in regard to his body." I had no liking for the adventure, but I dressed hurriedly, an occasional shudder of premonition shaking me. Once fully clad, I followed Conrad out of the house and up the silent road which led to the house of John Grimland. The road wound uphill, and all the way, looking upward and forward, I could see that great grim house perched like a bird of evil on the crest of the hill, bulking black and stark against the stars. In the west pulsed a single dull red smear, where the young moon had just sunk from view behind the low black hills. The whole night seemed full of brooding evil, and the persistent swishing of a bat's wings somewhere overhead caused my taut nerves to jerk and thrum. To drown the quick pounding of my own heart, I said, "Do you share the belief so many hold, that John Grimland was mad?" We strode on several paces before Conrad answered, seemingly with a strange reluctance. "But for one incident, I would say no man was ever saner. But one night in his study, he seemed suddenly to break all bonds of reason. He had discoursed for hours on his favourite subject, black magic, when suddenly he cried, as his face lit with a weird unholy glow, 'Why should I sit here babbling such child's prattle to you? These voodoo rituals, these Shinto sacrifices, feathered snakes, goats without horns, black leopard cults, bah! Filth and dust that the wind blows away, dregs of the real unknown, the deep mysteries, mere echoes from the abyss. I could tell you things that would shatter your paltry brain. I would breathe into your ear names that would wither you like a burnt weed. What do you know of Yog-Sothoth, of Cathalos and the sunken cities? None of these names is even included in your mythologies. Not even in your dreams have you glimpsed the black cyclopean walls of Koth, or shriveled before the noxious winds that blow from Yuggoth. But I will not blast you lifeless with my black wisdom. I cannot expect your infantile brain to bear what mine holds. Were you as old as I? Had you seen, as I have seen, kingdoms crumble and generations pass away? Had you gathered as ripe grain the dark secrets of the centuries? He was raving away, his wildly lit face scarcely human in appearance, and suddenly, noting my evident bewilderment, he burst into a horrible, cackling laugh. "Gad!" he cried in a voice and accent strange to me. "Methinks I've frighted ye, and certes it is not to be marvelled at, sith ye but a naked savage in the arts of life after all. Ye think I be old, eh? Why, ye gaping loot, we'd drop dead when I were to divulge the generations of men I've known." But at this point such horror overcame me that I fled from him as from an adder, and his high-pitched diabolical laughter followed me out of the shadowy house. Some days later I received a letter apologizing for his manner and ascribing it candidly, too candidly, to drugs. I did not believe it, but I renewed our relations after some hesitation. "It sounds like utter madness," I muttered. "Yes," admitted Conrad hesitantly. "But, Kirawan, have you ever seen anyone who knew John Grimlin in his youth?" I shook my head. "I'd been at pains to inquire about him discreetly," said Conrad. "He has lived here, with the exception of mysterious absences, often for months at a time, for 20 years. The older villagers remember distinctly when he first came and took over that old house on the hill, and they all say that in the intervening years he seems not to have aged perceptibly. When he came here, he looked just as he does now, or did, up to the moment of his death, of the appearance of a man about 50. I met old Van Bunk in Vienna, who said he knew Grimlin when a very young man studying in Berlin 50 years ago, and he expressed astonishment that the old man was still living, for he said that at that time Grimlin seemed to be about 50 years of age." I gave an incredulous exclamation, seeing the implication toward which the conversation was trending. "Nonsense! Professor von Bunk was past 80 himself, and liable to the errors of extreme age. He confused this man with another." Yet, as I spoke, my flesh crawled unpleasantly, and the hairs on my neck prickled. "Well," shrugged Conrad, "here we are at the house." The huge pile reared up menacingly before us, and as we reached the front door, a vagrant wind moaned through the nearby trees, and I started, foolishly, as I again heard the ghostly beat of the bat's wings. Conrad turned a large key in the antique lock, and as we entered, a cold draught swept across us like a breath from the grave, mouldy and cold. I shuddered. We groped our way through a black hallway and into a study, and here Conrad lighted a candle, for no gas lights or electric lights were to be found in the house. I looked about me, dreading what the light might disclose, but the room, heavily tapestried and bizarrely furnished, was empty, save for us two. Where is it?" I asked in a husky whisper, from a throat gone dry. "Upstairs," answered Conrad in a low voice, showing that the silence and mystery of the house had laid a spell on him also. "Upstairs in the library where he died." I glanced up involuntarily. Somewhere above our heads, the lone master of this grim house was stretched out in his last sleep, silent, his white face set in a grinning mask of death. Panic swept over me, and I fought for control. After all, it was merely the corpse of a wicked old man who was past harming anyone. This argument rang hollowly in my brain, like the words of a frightened child who is trying to reassure himself. I turned to Conrad. He had taken a time-yellowed envelope from an inside pocket. "This," he said, removing from the envelope several pages of closely written, time-yellowed parchment, "is, in effect, The last word of John Grimlin, though God alone knows how many years ago it was written. He gave it to me 10 years ago, immediately after his return from Mongolia. It was shortly after this that he had his first seizure. This envelope he gave me, sealed, and he made me swear that I would hide it carefully, and that I would not open it until he was dead, when I was to read the contents and follow their directions exactly. More, he made me swear that no matter what he said or did after giving me the envelope, I would go ahead as first directed. For, he said with a fearful smile, the flesh is weak, but I am a man of my word, and though I might in a moment of weakness wish to retract, it is far, far too late now. You may never understand the matter, but you are to do as I have said. Well? Well, again Conrad wiped his brow. Tonight, as he lay writhing in his death agonies, his wordless howls were mingled with frantic admonitions to me to bring him the envelope and destroy it before his eyes. As he yammered this, he forced himself up on his elbows, and with eyes starting and hair standing straight up on his head, he screamed at me in a manner to chill the blood. And he was shrieking for me to destroy the envelope, not to open it. And once he howled in his delirium for me to hew his body into pieces and scatter the bits to the four winds of heaven. An uncontrollable exclamation of horror escaped my dry lips. At last, went on Conrad, I gave in. Remembering his commands 10 years ago, I at first stood firm, but at last, as his screeches grew unbearably desperate, I turned to go for the envelope, even though that meant leaving him alone. But as I turned, with one last fearful convulsion in which blood-flecked foam flew from his writhing lips, the life went from his twisted body in a single great wrench. He fumbled at the parchment. I am going to carry out my promise. The directions herein seem fantastic, and may be the whims of a disordered mind, but I gave my word. They are, briefly, that I place his corpse on the great black ebony table in his library, with 7 black candles burning about him. The doors and windows are to be firmly closed and fastened. Then, in the darkness which precedes dawn, I am to read the formula, charm, or spell, which is contained in a smaller sealed envelope inside the first, and which I have not yet opened. But is that all? I cried. No provisions as to the disposition of his fortune, his estate, or his corpse? Nothing. In his will, which I have seen elsewhere, he leaves estate and fortune to a certain Oriental gentleman named in the document as Malik Tus. What? I cried, shaken to my soul. Conrad, this is madness heaped on madness. Malik Tus? Good God! No mortal man was ever so named. That is the title of the foul god worshipped by the mysterious Yezidis, they of Mount Alamut the accursed, whose 8 brazen towers rise in the mysterious wastes of deep Asia. His idolatrous symbol is the brazen peacock, and the Muslims, who hate this demon-worshipping devotees, say he is the essence of the evil of all the universes, the prince of darkness, Ahriman, the old serpent, the veritable Satan. And you say Grimlin names this mythical demon in his will? It is the truth. Conrad's throat was dry. And look, he has scribbled a strange line at the corner of this parchment. Dig me no grave, I shall not need one. Again a chill wandered down my spine. In God's name, I cried in a kind of frenzy, let us get this incredible business over with. I think a drink might help, answered Conrad, moistening his lips. It seems to me I've seen Grimlin go into this cabinet for wine. He bent to the door of an ornately carved mahogany cabinet, and after some difficulty opened it. No wine here, he said disappointedly, and if I ever felt the need of stimulants— What's this?" He drew out a roll of parchment, dusty, yellowed, and half covered with spider webs. Everything in that grim house seemed, to my nervously excited senses, fraught with mysterious meaning and import, and I leaned over his shoulder as he unrolled it. "It's a record of peerage," he said. "Such a chronicle of births, deaths, and so forth, as the old families used to keep in the 16th century and earlier." "What's the name?" I asked. He scowled over the dim scrolls, striving to master the faded archaic script. "Grim. I've got it. Grimlan. Of course. It's the records of old John's family, the Grimlans of Toad's Heath Manor, Suffolk. What an outlandish name for an estate. Look at the last entry." Together we read, "John Grimlan, born March 10, 1630. And then we both cried out. Under this entry was freshly written, in a strange scrawling hand, "Died March 10, 1930. Below this there was a seal of black wax, stamped with a strange design, something like a peacock with a spreading tail. Conrad stared at me speechless. All the colour ebbed from his face. I shook myself with the rage engendered by fear. "It's the hoax of a madman!" I shouted. "The stage has been set with such great care that the actors have overstepped themselves. Whoever they are, they have heaped up so many incredible effects as to nullify them. It's all a very stupid, very dull drama of illusion." And even as I spoke, icy sweat stood out on my body, and I shook as with an ague. With a wordless motion, Conrad turned toward the stairs, taking up a large candle from a mahogany table. "It was understood, I suppose," he whispered, "that I should go through this ghastly matter alone, but I had not the moral courage, and now I'm glad I had not." A still horror brooded over the silent house as we went up the stairs. A faint breeze stole in from somewhere and set the heavy velvet hangings rustling, and I visualized stealthy taloned fingers drawing aside the tapestries to fix red gloating eyes upon us. Once I thought I heard the indistinct clumping of monstrous feet somewhere above us, but it must have been the heavy pounding of my own heart. The stairs debouched into a wide dark corridor, in which our feeble candle cast a faint gleam which but illuminated our pale faces and made the shadows seem darker by comparison. We stopped at a heavy door, and I heard Conrad's breath draw in sharply as a man's will when he braces himself physically or mentally. I involuntarily clenched my fists until the nails bit into the palms. Then Conrad thrust the door open. A sharp cry escaped his lips. The candle dropped from his nerveless fingers and went out. The library of John Grimlan was ablaze with light, though the whole house had been in darkness when we entered it. This light came from 7 black candles placed at regular intervals about the great ebony table. On this table, between the candles, I had braced myself against the sight. Now, in the face of the mysterious illumination and the sight of the thing on the table, my resolution nearly gave way. John Grimlan had been unlovely in life. In death, he was hideous. Yes, he was hideous, even though his face was mercifully covered with the same curious silken robe, which, worked in fantastic bird-like designs, covered his whole body, except the crooked claw-like hands and the bare withered feet. A strangling sound came from Conrad. "My God," he whispered, "what is this?" I laid his body out on the table and placed the candles about it, but I did not light them, nor did I place that robe over the body. And there were bedroom slippers on his feet when I left. He halted suddenly. We were not alone in the death room. At first we had not seen him, as he sat in the great armchair in a farther nook of a corner, so still that he seemed a part of the shadows cast by the heavy tapestries. As my eyes fell upon him, a violent shuddering shook me, and a feeling akin to nausea racked the pit of my stomach. My first impression was of vivid, oblique yellow eyes which gazed unwinkingly at us. Then the man rose and made a deep salaam, and we knew that he was an Oriental. Now when I strive to etch him clearly in my mind, I can resurrect no plain image of him. I only remember those piercing eyes, and the yellow fantastic robe he wore. We returned his salute mechanically, and he spoke in a low, refined voice. "Gentlemen, I crave your pardon. I have made so free as to light the candles. Shall we not proceed with the business pertaining to a mutual friend?" He made a slight gesture toward the silent bulk on the table. Conrad nodded, evidently unable to speak. The thought flashed through our minds at the same time that this man had also been given a sealed envelope. But how had he come to the Grimland house so quickly? John Grimland had been dead scarcely 2 hours, and to the best of our knowledge no one knew of his demise but ourselves. And how had he got into the locked and bolted house? The whole affair was grotesque and unreal in the extreme. We did not even introduce ourselves or ask the stranger his name. He took charge in a matter-of-fact way, and so under the spell of horror and illusion were we, that we moved dazedly, involuntarily obeying his suggestions, given us in a low, respectful tone. I found myself standing on the left side of the table, looking across its grisly burden at Conrad. The Oriental stood with arms folded and head bowed at the head of the table, nor did it then strike me as being strange that he should stand there instead of Conrad, who was to read what Grimland had written. I found my gaze drawn to the figure worked on the breast of the stranger's robe in black silk, a curious figure, somewhat resembling a peacock, and somewhat resembling a bat, or a flying dragon. I noticed with a start that the same design was worked on the robe covering the corpse. The doors had been locked, the windows fastened down. Conrad, with a shaky hand, opened the inner envelope and fluttered open the parchment sheets contained therein. These sheets seemed much older than those containing the instructions to Conrad in the larger envelope. Conrad began to read in a monotonous drone, which had the effect of hypnosis on the hearer, so at times the candles grew dim in my gaze, and the room and its occupants swam, strange and monstrous, veiled and distorted like an hallucination. Most of what he read was gibberish. It meant nothing, yet the sound of it and the archaic style of it filled me with an intolerable horror. "To the contract elsewhere recorded, I, John Grimland, hereby swear by the name of the Nameless One to keep good faith. Wherefore do I now write in blood these words spoken to me in this grim and silent chamber, in the dead city of Koth, whereto no mortal man hath attained but me. These same words, now writ down by me to be read over my body at the appointed time, to fulfill my part of the bargain, which I entered into of mine own free will and knowledge, being of right mind, and 50 years of age this year of 1680 A.D. Here beginneth the incantation. Before man was, the elder ones were, and even yet their Lord dwelleth among the shadows, to which if a man set his foot, he may not turn upon his track." The words merged into a barbaric gibberish as Conrad stumbled through an unfamiliar language, a language faintly suggesting the Phoenician, but shuddery with a touch of a hideous antiquity beyond any remembered earthly tongue. One of the candles flickered and went out. I made a move to relight it, but a motion from the silent Oriental stayed me. His eyes burned into mine, then shifted back to the still form on the table. The manuscript had shifted back into its archaic English. "And the mortal which gaineth to the black citadels of Koth and speaks with the dark lord whose face is hidden, for a price may he gain his heart's desire, riches and knowledge beyond counting, and life beyond mortal span, even 250 years. Again Conrad's voice trailed off into unfamiliar gutturals. Another candle went out. "Let not the mortal flinch as the time draweth nigh for payment, and the fires of hell lay hold upon the vitals as the sign of reckoning. For the Prince of Darkness taketh his due in the end, and he is not to be cozened. What ye have promised, that shall ye deliver. Agwanthan Ashuba." At the first sound of those barbaric accents, a cold hand of terror locked about my throat. My frantic eyes shot to the candles, and I was not surprised to see another flicker out. Yet there was no hint of any draught to stir the heavy black hangings. Conrad's voice wavered. He drew his hand across his throat, gagging momentarily. The eyes of the Oriental never altered. "Among the sons of men glide strange shadows forever. Men see the tracks of the talons, but not yet the feet that made them. Over the souls of men spread great black wings. There is but one black master, though men call him Sathanas and Beelzebub and Apollyon and Ahriman and Malik Tus." Mists of horror engulfed me. I was dimly aware of Conrad's voice droning on, both in English and in that other fearsome tongue whose horrific import I scarcely dared try to guess. And with stark fear clutching at my heart, I saw the candles go out, one by one. And with each flicker, as the gathering gloom darkened about us, my horror mounted. I could not speak. I could not move. My distended eyes were fixed with agonized intensity on the remaining candle. The silent Oriental at the head of that ghastly table was included in my fear. He had not moved nor spoken, but under his drooping lids his eyes burned with devilish triumph. I knew that beneath his inscrutable exterior he was gloating fiendishly. But why? Why? But I knew that the moment the extinguishing of the last candle plunged the room into utter darkness, some nameless, abominable thing would take place. Conrad was approaching the end. His voice rose to the climax in gathering crescendo. "Approaches now the moment of payment. The ravens are flying. The bats wing against the sky. There are skulls in the stars. The soul and the body are promised and shall be delivered up, not to the dust again, nor the elements from which spring life." The candle flickered slightly. I tried to scream, but my mouth gaped to a soundless yammering. I tried to flee, but I stood frozen, unable even to close my eyes. "The abyss yawns, and the debt is to pay. The light fails, the shadows gather. There is no God but evil, no light but darkness, no hope but doom." A hollow groan resounded through the room. It seemed to come from the robe-covered thing on the table. That robe twitched fitfully. "Oh, wings in the black dark!" I started violently. A faint swish sounded in the gathering shadows. The stir of the dark hangings? It sounded like the rustle of gigantic wings. "Oh, red eyes in the shadows! What is promised, what is writ in blood is fulfilled. The light is gulfed in blackness. Yaakov!" The last candle went out suddenly, and a ghastly, unhuman cry that came not from my lips or from Conrad's burst unbearably forth. Horror swept over me like a black icy wave. In the blind dark I heard myself screaming terribly. Then with a swirl and a great rush of wind, something swept the room, flinging the hangings aloft and dashing chairs and tables crashing to the floor. For an instant an intolerable odour burned our nostrils. A low, hideous tittering mocked us in the blackness. Then silence fell like a shroud. Somehow Conrad found a candle and lighted it. The faint glow showed us the room in fearful disarray, showed us each other's ghastly faces, and showed us the black ebony table empty. The doors and windows were locked as they had been, but the Oriental was gone, and so was the corpse of John Grimlin. Shrieking like damned men, we broke down the door and fled frenziedly down the well-like staircase, where the darkness seemed to clutch at us with clammy black fingers. As we tumbled down into the lower hallway, a lurid glow cut the darkness, and the scent of burning wood filled our nostrils. The outer doorway held momentarily against our frantic assault, then gave way, and we hurtled into the outer starlight. Behind us the flames leaped up with a crackling roar as we fled down the hill. Conrad, glancing over his shoulder, halted suddenly, wheeled, and flung up his arms like a madman and screamed, "Soul and body he sold to Malik Tus, who is Satan 250 years ago. This was the night of payment. And my God, look, look! The fiend has claimed his own!" I looked, frozen with horror. Flames had enveloped the whole house with appalling swiftness, and now the great mass was etched against the shadowed sky, a crimson inferno. And above the Holocaust hovered a gigantic black shadow like a monstrous bat, and from its dark clutch dangled a small white thing like the body of a man, dangling limply. Then, even as we cried out in horror, it was gone, and our dazed gaze met only the shuddering walls and blazing roof which crumpled into the flames with an earth-shaking roar.
The end. Subscribe for more at storiesoffuturespast.substack.com. And now for the next story.
The Curse of Yig by Zealia Brown Reed. Ghostwritten by H.P. Lovecraft. Originally published in Weird Tales, November 1929. Narrated by Tom Trussel. In 1925, I went into Oklahoma looking for snake lore, and I came out with a fear of snakes that will last me the rest of my life. I admit it is foolish, since there are natural explanations for everything I saw and heard, but it masters me none the less. If the old story had been all there was to it, I would not have been so badly shaken. My work as an American Indian ethnologist has hardened me to all kinds of extravagant legendary, and I know that simple white people can beat the Redskins at their own game when it comes to fanciful inventions. But I can't forget what I saw with my own eyes at the insane asylum in Guthrie. I called it that asylum because a few of the oldest settlers told me I would find something important there. Neither Indians nor white men would discuss the snake god legends I had come to trace. The oil boom newcomers, of course, knew nothing of such matters, and the red men and old pioneers were plainly frightened when I spoke of them. Not more than 6 or 7 people mentioned the asylum, and those who did were careful to talk in whispers. But the whisperers said that Dr. McNeil could show me a very terrible relic and tell me all I wanted to know. He could explain why Yig, the half-human father of serpents, is a shunned and feared subject in central Oklahoma, and why old settlers shiver at the secret Indian orgies which make the autumn days and nights hideous with the ceaseless beating of tom-toms in lonely places. It was with the scent of a hound on the trail that I went to Guthrie,
for I had spent many years collecting data on the evolution of serpent worship among the Indians. I had always felt, from well-defined undertones of legend and archaeology, that great Quetzalcoatl, benign snake god of the Mexicans, had had an older and darker prototype, and during recent months I had well-nigh proved it in a series of researches stretching from Guatemala to the Oklahoma plains. But everything was tantalizing and incomplete, for above the border the cult of the snake was hedged about by fear and furtiveness. Now it appeared that a new and copious source of data was about to dawn, and I sought the head of the asylum with an eagerness I did not try to cloak. Dr. McNeil was a small, clean-shaven man of somewhat advanced years, and I saw at once from his speech and manner that he was a scholar of no mean attainments in many branches outside his profession. Grave and doubtful when I first made known my errand, his face grew thoughtful as he carefully scanned my credentials and the letter of introduction which a kindly old ex-Indian agent had given me. "So you've been studying the Yig legend, eh?" he reflected sententiously. "I know that many of our Oklahoma ethnologists have tried to connect with the Quetzalcoatl, but I don't think any of them have traced the intermediate steps so well. You've done remarkable work for a man as young as you seem to be, and you certainly deserve all the data we can give." "I don't suppose old Major Moore or any of the others told you what it is I have here. They don't like to talk about it, and neither do I. It is very tragic and very horrible, but that is all. I refuse to consider it anything supernatural. There's a story about it that I'll tell you after you see it. A devilish sad story, but one that I won't call magic. It merely shows the potency that belief has over some people. I'll admit there are times when I feel a shiver that's more than physical, but in daylight I set all that down to nerves. I'm not a young fellow any more, alas. To come to the point, the thing I have is what you might call a victim of Yig's curse, a physically living victim. We don't let the bulk of the nurses see it, although most of them know it's here. There are just 2 steady old chaps whom I've let feed it and clean out its quarters. Used to be 3, but good old Stevens passed on a few years ago. I suppose I'll have to break in a new group pretty soon, for the thing doesn't seem to age or change much, and we old boys can't last forever. Maybe the ethics of the near future will let us give it a merciful release, but it's hard to tell. Did you see that single ground glass basement window over in the east wing when you came up the drive? That's where it is. I'll take him out there myself now. You needn't make any comment. Just look through the movable panel in the door and thank God the light isn't any stronger. Then I'll tell you the story, or as much as I've been able to piece together. We walked downstairs very quietly, and did not talk as we threaded the corridors of the seemingly deserted basement. Dr. McNeil unlocked a grey-painted steel door, but it was only a bulkhead leading to a further stretch of hallway. At length he paused before a door marked B116, opened a small observation panel which he could use only by standing on tiptoe, and pounded several times upon the painted metal, as if to arouse the occupant, whatever it might be. A faint stench came from the aperture as the doctor unclosed it, and I fancied his pounding elicited a kind of low, hissing response. Finally he motioned me to replace him at the peephole, and I did so with a causeless and increasing tremor. The barred ground-glass window, closed to the earth outside, admitted only a feeble and uncertain pallor, and I had to look into the malodorous den for several seconds before I could see what was crawling and wriggling about on the straw-covered floor, emitting every now and then a weak and vacuous hiss. Then the shadowed outlines began to take shape, and I perceived that the squirming entity bore some remote resemblance to a human form laid flat on its belly. I clutched at the door handle for support as I tried to keep from fainting. The moving object was almost of human size and entirely devoid of clothing. It was absolutely hairless, and its tawny-looking back seemed subtly squamous in the dim, ghoulish light. Around the shoulders it was rather speckled and brownish, and the head was very curiously flat. As it looked up to hiss at me, I saw that the beady little black eyes were damnably anthropoid, but I could not bear to study them long. They fastened themselves on me with a horrible persistence, so that I closed the panel gaspingly and left the creature to wriggle about unseen in its matted straw and spectral twilight. I must have reeled a bit, for I saw that the doctor was gently holding my arm as he guided me away. I was stuttering over and over again. But for God's sake, what is it? Dr. McNeill told me the story in his private office as I sprawled opposite him in an easy chair. The golden crimson of late afternoon changed to the violet of early dusk, but still I sat awed and motionless. I resented every ring of the telephone and every whir of the buzzer, and I could have cursed the nurses and intern whose knocks now and then summoned the doctor briefly to the outer office. Night came, and I was glad my host switched on all the lights. Scientist though I was, my zeal for research was half forgotten amid such breathless ecstasies of fright as a small boy might feel when whispered witch tales go the rounds of the chimney corner. It seems that Yig, the snake god of the Central Plains tribes, presumably the primal source of the more southerly Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan, was an odd, half-anthropomorphic devil of highly arbitrary and capricious nature. He was not wholly evil, and was usually quite well disposed toward those who gave proper respect to him and his children, the serpents. But in the autumn he became abnormally ravenous, and had to be driven away by means of suitable rites. That was why the tom-toms in the Pawnee, Wichita, and Caddo country pounded ceaselessly week in and week out in August, September, and October, and why the medicine men made strange noises with rattles and whistles curiously like those of the Aztecs and Mayas. Yig's chief trait was a relentless devotion to his children, a devotion so great that the redskins almost feared to protect themselves from the venomous rattlesnakes which thronged the region. Frightful clandestine tales hinted of his vengeance upon mortals who had flouted him, or wreaked harm upon his wriggling progeny, his chosen method being to turn his victim, after suitable tortures, to a spotted snake. In the old days of the Indian Territory, the doctor went on, there was not quite so much secrecy about Yig. The plains tribes, less cautious than the desert nomads and pueblos, talked quite freely of the legends and autumn ceremonies with the first Indian agents, and let considerable of the lore spread out through the neighboring regions of white settlement. The great fear came in the land rush days of '89, when some extraordinary incidents had been rumoured, and the rumours sustained by what seemed to be hideously tangible proofs. Indians said that the new white men did not know how to get on with Yig, and afterward the settlers came to take that theory at face value. Now no old-timer in middle Oklahoma, white or red, could be induced to breathe a word about the snake god except in vague hints. Yet after all, the doctor added with almost needless emphasis, the only truly authenticated horror had been a thing of pitiful tragedy rather than of bewitchment. It was all very material and cruel, even that last phase which had caused so much dispute. Dr. McNeill paused and cleared his throat before getting down to his special story, and I felt a tingling sensation as to when a theatre curtain rises. The thing had begun when Walker Davis and his wife Audrey left Arkansas to settle in the newly opened public lands in the spring of 1889, and the end had come in the country of the Wichitas, north of the Washita River, in what is at present Caddo County. There is a small village called Binger there now, and the railway goes through, but otherwise the place is less changed than other parts of Oklahoma. It is still a section of farms and ranches, quite productive in these days, since the great oil fields do not come very close. Walker and Audrey had come from Franklin County in the Ozarks with a canvas-topped wagon, 2 mules, an ancient and useless dog called Wolf, and all their household goods. They were typical hill folk, youngish and perhaps a little more ambitious than most, and looked forward to a life of better returns for their hard work than they had had in Arkansas. Both were lean, raw-boned specimens, the man tall, sandy and grey-eyed, and the woman short and rather dark, with a black straightness of hair suggesting a slight Indian admixture. In general, there was very little of distinction about them, and but for one thing, their annals might not have differed from those of thousands of other pioneers who flocked into the new country at that time. That thing was Walker's almost epileptic fear of snakes, which some laid to prenatal causes, and some said came from a dark prophecy about his end, with which an old Indian squaw had tried to scare him when he was small. Whatever the cause, the effect was marked indeed, for despite his strong general courage, the very mention of a snake would cause him to grow faint and pale, while the sight of even a tiny specimen would produce a shock sometimes bordering on a convulsion seizure. The Davises started out early in the year, in the hope of being on the new land for the spring ploughing. Travel was slow, for the roads were bad in Arkansas, while in the territory there were great stretches of rolling hills and red sandy barrens without any roads whatever. As the terrain grew flatter, the change from their native mountains depressed them more, perhaps, than they realized, but they found the people at the Indian agencies very affable, while most of the settled Indians seemed friendly and civil. Now and then they encountered a fellow pioneer, with whom crude pleasantries and expressions of amiable rivalry were generally exchanged. Owing to the season, there were not many snakes in evidence, so Walker did not suffer from his special temperamental weakness. In the earlier stages of the journey, too, there were no Indian snake legends to trouble him, for the transplanted tribes from the southeast do not share the wider beliefs of their western neighbors. As fate would have it, it was a white man at Ocmulgee in the Creek country who gave the Davises the first hint of the Yig beliefs, a hint which had a curiously fascinating effect on Walker and caused him to ask questions very freely after that. Before long, Walker's fascination had developed into a bad case of fright. He took the most extraordinary precautions at each of the nightly camps, always clearing away whatever vegetation he found, and avoiding stony places wherever he could. Every clump of stunted bushes and every cleft in the great slab-like rocks seemed to him now to hide malevolent serpents, while every human figure not obviously part of the settlement or emigrant train seemed to him a potential snake god till nearness had proved the contrary. Fortunately, no troublesome encounters came at this stage to shake his nerves still further. As they approached the Kickapoo County, they found it harder and harder to avoid camping near rocks. Finally, it was no longer possible, and poor Walker was reduced to the puerile expedient of droning some of the rustic anti-snake charms he had learned from his boyhood. 2 or 3 times a snake was really glimpsed, and these sights did not help the sufferer in his efforts to preserve composure. On the 22nd evening of the journey, a savage wind made it imperative, for the sake of the mules, to camp in as sheltered a spot as possible, and Audrey persuaded her husband to take advantage of a cliff which rose uncommonly high above the dried bed of a former tributary of the Canadian River. He did not like the rocky cast of the place, but allowed himself to be overruled this once, leading the animals suddenly toward the protecting slope, which the nature of the ground would not allow the wagon to approach. Audrey, examining the rocks near the wagon, meanwhile noticed a singular sniffing on the part of the feeble old dog. Seizing a rifle, she followed his lead, and presently thanked her stars that she had forestalled Walker in her discovery, for there, snugly nested in the gap between 2 boulders, was a sight it would have done him no good to see. Visible only as one convoluted expanse, but perhaps comprising as many as 3 or 4 separate units, was a mass of lazy wriggling which could not be other than a brood of new-born rattlesnakes. Anxious to save Walker from a trying shock, Audrey did not hesitate to act, but took the gun firmly by the barrel and brought the butt down again and again upon the writhing objects. Her own sense of loathing was great, but it did not amount to a real fear. Finally, she saw that her task was done, and turned to cleanse the improvised bludgeon in the red sand and dry dead grass nearby. She must, she reflected, cover the nest up before Walker got back from tethering the mules. Old Wolf, tottering relic of mixed shepherd and coyote ancestry that he was, had vanished, and she feared he had gone to fetch his master. Footsteps at that instant proved her fear well founded. A second more, and Walker had seen everything. Audrey made a move to catch him if he should faint, but he did not no more than sway. Then the look of pure fright on his bloodless face turned slowly to something like mingled awe and anger, and he began to upbraid his wife in trembling tones. "God's sake, Aud, but why'd ye go to do that? Hain't ye heard all the things they'd been telling about the snake devil Yig? You'd ought to told me, and we'd have moved on. Don't you know there's a devil god what gets even if he hurts his children? What for do you think the Injuns all dances and beats their drums in the fall about? This land's under a curse, I tell ye. Nigh every soul we've a talked to since we come in said the same. Yig rules here, and he comes out every fall for to get his victims and turn 'em into snakes. Why, Aud, they don't none of them Injuns across the cage and kill his cake for love or money. God knows what ye done to yourself, gal, a stomping out a hull brood of Yig's children. He'll get ye, sure, sooner or later, unless'n I kin by a charm offen some of the Injun medicine men. He'll get ye, Aud, as soon as there's a God in heaven. He'll come out of the night and turn ye into a crawling spotted snake." All the rest of the journey, Walker kept up the frightened reproofs and prophecies. They crossed the Canadian near Newcastle, and soon afterward met with the first of the real Plains Indians they had seen, a party of blanketed witch-eaters, whose leader talked freely under the spell of whiskey offered him, and taught poor Walker a long-winded protective charm against Yig in exchange for a quart bottle of the same inspiring fluid. By the end of the week, the chosen site in the witch-eater country was reached, and the Davises made haste to trace their boundaries and perform the spring ploughing before even beginning the construction of a cabin. The region was flat, drearily windy, and sparse of natural vegetation, but promised great fertility under cultivation. Occasional outcroppings of granite diversified the soil of decomposed red sandstone, and here and there a great flat rock would stretch along the surface of the ground like a man-made floor. There seemed to be very few snakes, or possible dens for them, so Audrey at last persuaded Walker to build the one-room cabin over a vast smooth slab of exposed stone. With such a flooring, and with a good-sized fireplace, the wettest weather might be defied, though it soon became evident that dampness was no salient quality of the district. Logs were hauled in the wagon from the nearest belt of woods, many miles toward the Wichita Mountains. Walker built his wide-chimneyed cabin and crude barn with the aid of some of the other settlers, though the nearest one was over a mile away. In turn, he helped his helpers at similar house-raising, so that many ties of friendship sprang up between the new neighbors. There was no town worthy the name nearer than El Reno, on the railway 30 miles or more to the northeast, and before many weeks had passed, the people of the section had become very cohesive despite the wideness of their scattering. The Indians, a few of whom had begun to settle down on ranches, were for the most part harmless, though somewhat quarrelsome when fired by the liquid stimulation which found its way to them despite all government bans. Of all the neighbors, the Davises found Joe and Sally Compton, who likewise hailed from Arkansas, the most helpful and congenial. Sally is still alive, known now as Grandma Compton, and her son Clyde, then an infant in arms, had become one of the leading men of the state. Sally and Audrey used to visit each other often, for their cabins were only 2 miles apart, and in the long spring and summer afternoons they exchanged many a tale of old Arkansas and many a rumor about the new country. Sally was very sympathetic about Walker's weakness regarding snakes, but perhaps did more to aggravate than cure the parallel nervousness which Audrey was acquiring through his incessant praying and prophesying about the Curse of Yig. She was uncommonly full of gruesome snake stories, and produced a direfully strong impression with her acknowledged masterpiece, the tale of a man in Scott County who had been bitten by a whole horde of rattlers at once, and had swelled so monstrously from poison that his body had finally burst with a pop. Needless to say, Audrey did not repeat this anecdote to her husband, and she implored the Comptons to beware of starting in on the rounds of the countryside. It is to Joe's and Sally's credit that they heeded this plea with the utmost fidelity. Walker did his corn planting early, and in midsummer improved his time by harvesting a fair crop of the native grass of the region. With the help of Joe Compton, he dug a well which gave a moderate supply of very good water, though he planned to sink an artesian later on. He did not run into many serious snake scares, and made his land as inhospitable as possible for wriggling visitors. Every now and then he rode over to the cluster of thatched conical huts which formed the main village of the witch-eaters, and talked long with the old men and shamans about the snake god and how to nullify his wrath. Charms were always ready in exchange for whiskey, but much of the information he got was far from reassuring. Yig was a great god. He was bad medicine. He did not forget things. In the autumn his children were hungry and wild, and Yig was hungry and wild too. All the tribes made medicine against Yig when the corn harvest came. They gave him some corn, and danced in proper regalia to the sound of whistle, rattle, and drum. They kept the drums pounding to drive Yig away, and called down the aid of Tirawa, whose children men are, even as the snakes are Yig's children. It was bad that the score of Davis killed the children of Yig. Let Davis say the charms many times when the corn harvest comes. Yig is Yig. Yig is a great god. By the time the corn harvest did come, Walker had succeeded in getting his wife into a deplorably jumpy state. His prayers and borrowed incantations came to be a nuisance, and when the autumn rites of the Indians began, there was always a distant wind-borne pounding of tom-toms to lend an added background to the sinister. It was maddening to have the muffled clatter always stealing over the wide red plains. Why would it never stop? Day and night, week on week, it was always going in exhaustless relays, as persistently as the red dusty winds that carried it. Audrey loathed it more than her husband did, for he saw in it a compensating element of protection. It was with this sense of a mighty, intangible bulwark against the evil that he got in his corn crop and prepared cabin and stable for the coming winter. The autumn was abnormally warm, and except for their primitive cookery, the Davises found scant use for the stone fireplace Walker had built with such care. Something in the unnaturalness of the hot dust clouds preyed on the nerves of all the settlers, but most of all on Audrey's and Walker's. The notions of a hovering snake curse and the weird, endless rhythm of the distant Indian drums formed a bad combination which any added element of the bizarre went far to render utterly unendurable. Notwithstanding this strain, several festive gatherings were held at one or another of the cabins after the crops were reaped, keeping naively alive in modernity those curious rites of the harvest home which are as old as human agriculture itself. Lafayette Smith, who came from southern Missouri and had a cabin about 3 miles east of Walker's, was a very passable fiddler, and his tunes did much to make the celebrants forget the monotonous beating of the distant tom-toms. Then Halloween drew near, and the settlers planned another frolic. This time, had they but known it, of a lineage older than era agriculture, the dread witch Sabbath of the primal Pre-Aryans, kept alive through ages in the midnight blackness of secret woods, and still hinting at vague terrors under its latter-day mask of comedy and lightness. Halloween was to fall on a Thursday, and the neighbours agreed to gather for their first revel at the Davis cabin. It was on the 31st of October that the warm spell broke. The morning was grey and leaden, and by noon the incessant winds had changed from searingness to rawness. People shivered all the more because they were not prepared for the chill, and Walker Davis's old dog Wolf dragged himself wearily indoors to a place beside the hearth. But the distant drums still thumped on, nor were the white citizenry less inclined to pursue their chosen rites. As early as 4 in the afternoon, the wagons began to arrive at Walker's cabin, and in the evening, after a memorable barbecue, Lafayette Smith's fiddle inspired a very fair-sized company to great feats of saltatory grotesqueness in the one good-sized but crowded room. The younger folk indulged in the amiable inanities proper for the season, and now and then old Wolf would howl with doleful and spine-tingling ominousness at some especially spectral strain from Lafayette's squeaky violin, a device he had never heard before. Mostly, though, this battered veteran slept through the merriment, for it was past the age of active interests, and lived largely in his dreams. Tom and Jenny Rigby had brought their collie Zeke along, but the canines did not fraternize. Zeke seemed strangely uneasy over something, and nosed around curiously all the evening. Audrey and Walker made a fine couple on the floor, and Grandma Compton still likes to recall her impression of their dancing that night. Their worries seemed forgotten for the nonce, and Walker was shaved and trimmed into a surprising degree of spruceness. By 10 o'clock, all hands were healthily tired, and the guests began to depart family by family, with many handshakings and bluff assurances of what a fine time everybody had had. Tom and Jenny thought Zeke's eerie howls as he followed them to their wagon were marks of regret at having to go home, though Audrey said it must be the far-away tom-toms which annoyed him, for the distant thumping was surely ghastly enough after the merriment within. The night was bitterly cold, and for the first time Walker put a great log in the fireplace and banked it with ashes to keep it smouldering till morning. Old Wolf dragged himself within the ruddy glow and lapsed into his customary coma. Audrey and Walker, too tired to think of charms or curses, tumbled into the rough pine bed and were asleep before the cheap alarm clock on the mantel had ticked out 3 minutes. And from far away, the rhythmic pounding of those hellish tom-toms still pulsed on the chill night wind. Dr. McNeil paused here and removed his glasses, as if a blurring of the objective world might make the reminiscent vision clearer. "You'll soon appreciate," he said, "that I had a great deal of difficulty in piecing out all that happened after the guests left. There were times, though, at first, when I was able to make a try at it." After a moment of silence, he went on with the tale. Audrey had terrible dreams of Yig, who appeared to her in the guise of Satan, as depicted in cheap engravings she had seen. It was, indeed, from an absolute ecstasy of nightmare that she started suddenly awake to find Walker already conscious and sitting up in bed. He seemed to be listening intently to something, and silenced her with a whisper when she began to ask what had roused him. "Hark, Aud," he breathed. "Don't you hear something a-singing and buzzing and rustling? Do you reckon it's the fall crickets?" Certainly, there was distinctly audible within the cabin such a sound as he had described. Audrey tried to analyze it, and was impressed with some element at once horrible and familiar which hovered just outside the rim of her memory. And beyond it all, waking a hideous thought, the monotonous beating of the distant tom-toms came incessantly across the black plains on which a cloudy half-moon had set. "Walker, suppose it's the Curse of Yig?" She could feel him tremble. "No, gal, I don't reckon he comes that away. He's shaping like a man, except you look at him close. That's what Chief Grey Eagle says. This here's some varmints coming out in the cold. Not crickets, I calculate, but summat like 'em. I ought to get up and stomp 'em out afore they make such headway or get at the cupboard. He rose, felt for the lantern that hung within easy reach, and rattled the tin matchbox nailed to the wall beside it. Audrey sat up in bed and watched the flare of the match grow into the steady glow of the lantern. Then, as her eyes began to take in the whole of the room, the crude rafters shook with the frenzy of their simultaneous shriek, for the flat rocky floor, revealed in the new-born illumination, was one seething brown-speckled mass of wriggling rattlesnakes, slithering toward the fire, and even now turning their loathsome heads to menace the fright-blasted lantern-bearer. It was only for an instant that Audrey saw the things. The reptiles were of every size, of uncountable numbers, and apparently of several varieties, and even as she looked, 2 or 3 of them reared their heads as if to strike at Walker. She did not faint. It was Walker's crash to the floor that extinguished the lantern and plunged her into blackness. He had not screamed a second time. Fright had paralyzed him, and he fell as if shot by a silent arrow from no mortal's bow. To Audrey, the entire world seemed to whirl about fantastically, mingling with the nightmare from which she had started. Voluntary motion of any sort was impossible, for will and the sense of reality had left her. She fell back inertly on her pillow, hoping that she would wake soon. No actual sense of what had happened penetrated her mind for some time. Then, little by little, the suspicion that she was really awake began to dawn on her, and she was convulsed with a mounting blend of panic and grief which made her long to shriek out despite the inhibiting spell which kept her mute. Walker was gone, and she had not been able to help him. He had died of snakes, just as the old witch-woman had predicted when he was a little boy. Poor Wolf had not been able to help either. Probably he had not even awakened from his senile stupor. And now the crawling things must be coming for her, writhing closer and closer every moment in the dark, perhaps even now twining slipperily about the bedposts and oozing up over the coarse woolen blankets. Unconsciously she crept under the clothes and trembled. It must be the Curse of Yig. He had sent his monstrous children on All Hallows Night, and they had taken Walker first. Why was that? Wasn't he innocent enough? Why not come straight for her? Hadn't she killed those little rattlers alone? Then she thought of the curse's form as told by the Indians. She wouldn't be killed, just turned to a spotted snake. Ugh! So she would be like these things she had glimpsed on the floor, those things which Yig had sent to get her and enroll her among the number. She tried to mumble a charm that Walker had taught her, but found she could not utter a single sound. The noisy ticking of the alarm clock sounded above the maddening beat of the distant tom-toms. The snakes were taking a long time. Did they mean to delay on purpose, to play on her nerves? Every now and then she thought she felt a stealthy, insidious pressure on the bedclothes, but each time it turned out to be only the automatic twitchings of her overwrought nerves. The clock ticked on in the dark, and a change came slowly over her thoughts. Those snakes couldn't have taken so long. They couldn't be Yig's messengers after all, but just natural rattlers that were nested below the rock and had been drawn there by the fire. They weren't coming for her, perhaps. Perhaps they had sated themselves on poor Walker. Where were they now? Gone? Coiled by the fire? Still crawling over the prone corpse of their victim? The clock ticked, and the distant drums throbbed on. At the thought of her husband's body lying there in the pitch blackness, a thrill of purely physical horror passed over Audrey. That story of Sally Compton's about the man back in Scott County. He, too, had been bitten by a whole bunch of rattlesnakes. And what had happened to him? The poison had rotted the flesh and swelled the whole corpse, and in the end the bloated thing had burst horribly with a detestable popping noise. Was that what was happening to Walker down there on the rock floor? Instinctively she felt that she had begun to listen for something too terrible even to name to herself. The clock ticked on, keeping a kind of mocking, sardonic time with the far-off drumming that the night wind brought. She wished it were a striking clock, so that she could know how long this eldritch vigil must last. She cursed the toughness of fibre that kept her from fainting, and wondered what sort of relief the dawn could bring, after all. Probably neighbours would pass. No doubt somebody would call. Would they find her still sane? Was she still sane now? Morbidly listening, Audrey all at once became aware of something which she had to verify with every effort of her will before she could believe it, and which, once verified, she did not know whether to welcome or dread. The distant beating of the Indian tom-toms had ceased. They had always maddened her, but had not Walker regarded them as a bulwark against nameless evil from outside the universe? What were some of those things he had repeated to her in whispers after talking with Grey Eagle and the Wichita medicine men? She did not relish this new and sudden silence after all. There was something sinister about it. The loud ticking clock seemed abnormal in its new loneliness. Capable at last of conscious motion, she shook the covers from her face and looked into the darkness toward the window. It must have cleared after the moon set, for she saw the square aperture distinctly against the background of stars. Then, without warning, came that shocking, unutterable sound. Ugh! That dull, putrid pop of cleft skin and escaping poison in the dark. God! Sally's story, that obscene stench and this gnawing, clawing silence. It was too much. The bonds of muteness snapped, and the black night waxed reverberant with Audrey's screams of stark, unbridled frenzy. Consciousness did not pass away with the shock. How merciful if only it had! Amidst the echoes of her shrieking, Audrey still saw the star-sprinkled square of window ahead, and heard the doom-boding ticking of that frightful clock. Did she hear another sound? Was that square window still a perfect square? She was in no condition to weigh the evidence of her senses or distinguish between fact and hallucination. No, that window was not a perfect square. Something had encroached on the lower edge. Nor was the ticking of the clock the only sound in the room. There was, beyond dispute, a heavy breathing, neither her own nor poor Wolf's. Wolf slept very silently, and his wakeful wheezing was unmistakable. Then Audrey saw against the stars the black, demoniac silhouette of something anthropoid, the undulant bulk of a gigantic head and shoulders fumbling slowly toward her. "Ya! Ya! Go away! Go away! Go away, snake devil! Go away, Yig! I didn't want to kill him. I was feared he'd be scared of them. Don't, Yig, don't! I didn't go for to hurt your children. Don't come nigh me. Don't change me into no spotted snake." But the half-formless head and shoulders only lurched onward toward the bed, very silently. Everything snapped at once inside Audrey's head, and in a second she had turned from a cowering child to a raging madwoman. She knew where the axe was, hung against the wall on those pegs near the lantern. It was within easy reach, and she could find it in the dark. Before she was conscious of anything further, it was in her hands, and she was creeping toward the foot of the bed, toward the monstrous head and shoulders that every moment groped their way nearer. Had there been any light, the look on her face would not have been pleasant to see. "Take that, you! And that! And that! And that!" She was laughing shrilly now, and her cackles mounted higher as she saw that the starlight beyond the window was yielding to the dim prophetic pallor of coming dawn. Dr. McNeil wiped the perspiration from his forehead and put on his glasses again. I waited for him to resume. As he kept silent, I spoke softly. "She lived? She was found? Was it ever explained?" The doctor cleared his throat. "Yes, she lived, in a way, and it was explained. I'll tell you there was no bewitchment, only cruel, pitiful, material horror." It was Sally Compton who had made the discovery. She had ridden over to the Davis cabin the next afternoon to talk over the party with Audrey, and had seen no smoke from the chimney. That was queer. It had turned very warm again, yet Audrey was usually cooking something at that hour. The mules were making hungry-sounding noises in the barn, and there was no sign of old Wolf sunning himself in the accustomed spot by the door. Altogether, Sally did not like the look of the place, so was very timid and hesitant as she dismounted and knocked. She got no answer, but waited some time before trying the crude door of split logs. The lock, it appeared, was unfastened, and she slowly pushed her way in. Then, perceiving what was there, she reeled back, gasped, and clung to the jamb to preserve her balance. A terrible odour had welled out as she opened the door, but that was not what had stunned her. It was what she had seen. For within that shadowy cabin monstrous things had happened, and 3 shocking objects remained on the floor to awe and baffle the beholder. Near the burned-out fireplace was a great dog, purple decay on the skin left bare by mange and old age, and the old carcass burst by the puffing effect of rattlesnake poison. It must have been bitten by a veritable legion of the reptiles. To the right of the door was the axe-hacked remnant of what had been a man, clad in a nightshirt, and with the shattered bulk of a lantern clenched in one hand. He was totally free from any sign of snake-bite. Near him lay the ensanguined axe, carelessly discarded, and wriggling flat on the floor was a loathsome, vacant-eyed thing that had been a woman, but was now only a mute, mad caricature. All that this thing could do was to hiss and hiss and hiss. Both the doctor and I were brushing cold drops from our foreheads by this time. He poured something from a flask on his desk, took a nip, and handed another glass to me. I could only suggest tremulously and stupidly, "So Walker had only fainted that first time. The screams roused him, and the axe did the rest." "Yes." Dr. McNeil's voice was low. "But he met his death from snakes just the same. It was his fear working in 2 ways. It made him faint, and it made him fill his wife with the wild stories that caused her to strike out when she thought she saw the snake devil." I thought for a moment. "And Audrey, wasn't it queer how the Curse of Yig seemed to work itself out on her? I suppose the impression of hissing snakes had been fairly ground into her." "Yes, there were lucid spells at first, but they got to be fewer and fewer. Her hair came white at the roots as it grew, and later began to fall out. The skin grew blotchy, and when she died—" I interrupted with a start. "Died? Then what was that thing downstairs?" McNeil spoke gravely. "That is what was born to her 3/4 of a year afterward. There were 3 more of them. 2 were even worse, but this is the only one that lived."
The end. Subscribe for more at storiesoffuturespast.substack.com. And now for the next story. The Secret of Kralitz by Henry Kuttner. Originally published in Weird Tales, October 1936. Narrated by Tom Trussel. I awoke from profound sleep to find two black swathed forms standing silently beside me, their faces pale blurs in the gloom. As I blinked to clear my sleep-dimmed eyes, one of them beckoned impatiently, and suddenly I realized the purpose of this midnight summons. For years I had been expecting it, ever since my father, the Baron Kralitz, had revealed to me the secret and the curse that hung over our ancient house. And so, without a word, I rose and followed my guides as they led me along the gloomy corridors of the castle that had been my home since birth. As I proceeded, there rose up in my mind the stern face of my father, and in my ears rang his solemn words as he told me of the legendary curse of the house of Kralitz, the unknown secret that was imparted to the elder son of each generation at a certain time. When? I had asked my father as he lay on his deathbed, fighting back the approach of dissolution. When you are able to understand, he had told me, watching my face intently from beneath his tufted white brows. Some are told the secret sooner than others. Since the first Baron Kralitz, the secret has been handed down. He clutched at his breast and paused. It was fully 5 minutes before he had gathered his strength to speak again in his rolling, powerful voice. No gasping deathbed confessions for the Baron Kralitz. He said at last, You have seen the ruins of old monastery near the village, France. The first Baron burnt it and put the monks to the sword. The abbot interfered too often with the Baron's whims. A girl sought shelter, and the abbot refused to give her up at the Baron's demand. His patience was at an end. You know the tales they still tell about him. He slew the abbot, burned the monastery, and took the girl. Before he died, the abbot cursed his slayer, and cursed his sons for unborn generations. And it is the nature of this curse that is the secret of our house. I may not tell you what the curse is. Do not seek to discover it before it is revealed to you. Wait patiently, and in due time you will be taken by the warders of the secret down the stairway to the underground cavern, and then you will learn the secret of Kralitz. As the last word passed my father's lips, he died, his stern face still set in his harsh lines. Deep in my memories, I had not noticed our path, but now the dark forms of my guides paused beside a gap in the stone flagging, where a stairway which I had never seen during my wanderings about the castle led into subterranean depths. Down this stairway I was conducted, and presently I came to realize that there was a light of a sort, a dim phosphorescent radiance that came from no recognizable source, and seemed to be less actual light than the accustoming of my eyes to the near darkness. I went down for a long time. The stairway turned and twisted in the rock, and the bobbing forms ahead were my only relief from the monotony of the interminable descent. And at last, deep underground, the long stairway ended, and I gazed over at the shoulders of my guides at the great door that barred my path. It was roughly chiselled from the solid stone, and upon it were curious and strangely disquieting carvings, symbols which I did not recognize. It swung open, and I passed through and paused, staring about me through a grey sea of mist. I stood upon a gentle slope that fell away into the fog-hidden distance, from which came a pandemonium of muffled bellowing and high-pitched, shrill squeakings vaguely akin to obscene laughter. Dark, half-glimpsed shapes swam into sight through the haze and disappeared again, and great vague shadows swept overhead on silent wings. Almost beside me was a long rectangular table of stone, and at this table 200 of men were seated, watching me from eyes that gleamed dully out of deep sockets. My 2 guides silently took their places among them. And suddenly the thick fog began to lift. It was swept raggedly away on the breath of a chill wind. The far dim reaches of the cavern were revealed as the mist swiftly dissipated, and I stood silent in the grip of a mighty fear, and strangely, an equally potent, unaccountable thrill of delight. A part of my mind seemed to ask, "What horror is this?" And another part whispered, "You know this place." But I could never have seen it before. If I had realized what lay far beneath the castle, I could never have slept at night for the fear that would have obsessed me. For standing silent with conflicting tides of horror and ecstasy racing through me, I saw the weird inhabitants of this underground world. Demons, monsters, unnameable things. Nightmare colossi strode bellowing through the murk, and amorphous grey things like giant slugs walked upright on stumpy legs. Creatures of shapeless soft pulp, beings with flame-shot eyes scattered over their misshapen bodies like fabled Argus, writhed and twisted there in the evil glow. Winged things that were not bats swooped and fluttered in the tenebrous air, whispering sibilantly, whispering in human voices. Far away at the bottom of the slope, I could see the chill gleam of water, a hidden, sunless sea. Shapes mercifully almost hidden by distance and the semi-darkness sported and cried, troubling the surface of the lake, the size of which I could only conjecture, and a flapping thing whose leathery wings stretched like a tent above my head swooped and hovered for a moment, staring with flaming eyes, and then darted off and was lost in the gloom. And all the while, as I shuddered with fear and loathing, within me was this evil glee, this voice which whispered, "You know this place. You belong here. Is it not good to be home?" I glanced behind me. The great door had swung silently shut, and escape was impossible. And then pride came to my aid. I was a Kralitz, and a Kralitz would not acknowledge fear in the face of the devil himself. I stepped forward and confronted the warders, who were still seated regarding me intently from eyes in which a smouldering fire seemed to burn. Fighting down an insane dread that I might find before me an array of fleshless skeletons, I stepped to the head of the table, where there was a sort of crude throne, and peered closely at the silent figure on my right. It was no bare skull at which I gazed, but a bearded, deadly pale face. The curved, voluptuous lips were crimson, looking almost rouged, and the dull eyes stared through me bleakly. Inhuman agony had etched itself in deep lines on the white face, and gnawing anguish smouldered in the sunken eyes. I cannot hope to convey the utter strangeness, the atmosphere of unearthliness that surrounded him, almost as palpable as the fetid tomb stench that welled from his dark garments. He waved a black-swathed arm to the vacant seat at the head of the table, and I sat down. This nightmare sense of unreality. I seemed to be in a dream, with a hidden part of my mind slowly waking from sleep into evil life to take command of my faculties. The table was set with old-fashioned goblets and trenchers, such as had not been used for hundreds of years. There was meat on the trenchers, and red liquor in the jeweled goblets. A heady, overpowering fragrance swam up into my nostrils, mixed with the grave smell of my companions and the musty odor of a dank and sunless place. Every white face was turned to me, faces that seemed oddly familiar, though I did not know why. Each face was alike in its blood-red, sensual lips and its expression of gnawing agony and burning black eyes like the abysmal pits of Tartarus stared at me until I felt the short hairs stir on my neck. But I was a Kralitz. I stood up and said boldly in archaic German that somehow came familiarly from my lips, "I am France, 21st Baron Kralitz. What do you want with me?" A murmur of approval went around the long table. There was a stir. From the foot of the board a huge bearded man arose, a man with a frightful scar that made the left side of his face a horror of healed white tissue. Again, the odd thrill of familiarity ran through me. I had seen that face before, and vaguely I remembered looking at it through dim twilight. The man spoke in the old guttural German. "We greet you, France, Baron Kralitz. We greet you and pledge you, France, and we pledge the house of Kralitz." With that, he caught up the goblet before him and held it high. All along the long table the black-swathed ones arose, and each held high his jeweled cup and pledged me. They drank deeply, savouring the liquor, and I made the bow custom demanded. I said, in words that sprang almost unbidden from my mouth, "I greet you, who are warders of the secret of Kralitz, and I pledge you in return." All about me, to the farthermost reaches of the dim cavern, a hush fell, and the bellows and howlings and the insane tittering of the flying things were no longer heard. My companions leaned expectantly toward me. Standing alone at the head of the board, I raised my goblet and drank. The liquor was heady, exhilarating, with a faintly brackish flavour. And abruptly I knew why the pain-racked, ruined face of my companion had seemed familiar. I had seen it often among the portraits of my ancestors, the frowning, disfigured visage of the founder of the house of Kralitz that glared down from the gloom of the great hall. In that fierce white light of revelation I knew my companions for what they were. I recognized them, one by one, remembering their canvas counterparts. But there was a change. Like an impalpable veil, the stamp of ineradicable evil lay on the tortured faces of my hosts, strangely altering their features so that I could not always be sure I recognized them. One pale, sardonic face reminded me of my father, but I could not be so sure, so monstrously altered was its expression. I was dining with my ancestors, the house of Kralitz. My cup was still held high, and I drained it, for somehow the grim revelation was not entirely unexpected. A strange glow thrilled through my veins, and I laughed aloud for the evil delight that was in me. The others laughed too, a deep-throated merriment like the barking of wolves, tortured laughter from men stretched on the rack, mad laughter in hell. And all through the hazy cavern came the clamour of the devil's brood. Great figures that towered many spans high rocked with thundering glee, and the flying things tittered slyly overhead. And out over the vast expanse swept the wave of frightful mirth, until the half-seen things in the black waters sent out bellows that tore at my eardrums, and the unseen roof far overhead sent back roaring echoes of the clamour. And I laughed with them, laughed insanely until I dropped exhausted into my seat and watched the scarred man at the other end of the table as he spoke. "You are worthy to be of our company, and worthy to eat at the same board. We have pledged each other, and you are one of us. We shall eat together." And we fell to, tearing like hungry beasts at the succulent white meat in the jewelled trenchers. Strange monsters served us, and at a chill touch on my arm I turned to find a dreadful crimson thing, like a skinned child, refilling my goblet. Strange, strange, and utterly blasphemous was our feast. We shouted and laughed and fed there in the hazy light, while all around us thundered the evil horde. There was hell beneath Castle Kralitz, and it held high carnival this night. Presently, we sang a fierce drinking song, swinging the deep cups back and forth in rhythm with a shouted chant. It was an archaic song, but the obsolete words were no handicap, for I mouthed them as though they had been learned at my mother's knee. And at the thought of my mother, a trembling and a weakness ran through me abruptly, but I banished it with a draught of the heady liquor. Long, long we shouted and sang and caroused there in the great cavern, and after a time we arose together and trooped to where a narrow, high-arched bridge spanned the tenebrous waters of the lake. But I may not speak of what was at the other end of the bridge, nor of the unnameable things that I saw and did. I learned of the fungoid, inhuman beings that dwell on far, cold Yiggoth, of the cyclopean shapes that attend unsleeping Cthulhu in his submarine city, of the strange pleasures that the followers of leprous subterranean Yog-Sothoth may possess, and I learned, too, of the unbelievable manner in which Iod, the Source, is worshipped beyond the outer galaxies. I plumbed the blackest pits of hell, and came back, laughing. I was one with the rest of those dark warders, and I joined them in the Saturnalia of horror until the scarred man spoke to us again. "Our time grows short," he said, his scarred and bearded white face like a gargoyle's in the half-light. "We must depart soon. But you are a true Kralitz, Franz, and we shall meet again, and feast again, and make merry for longer than you think. One last pledge." I gave it to him. "To the house of Kralitz, may it never fall!" And with an exultant shout we drained the pungent dregs of the liquor. Then a strange lassitude fell upon me. With the others I turned my back on the cavern and the shapes that pranced and bellowed and crawled there, and I went up through the carved stone portal. We filed up the stairs, up and up, endlessly, until at last we emerged through the gaping hole in the stone flags and proceeded, a dark, silent company, back through those interminable corridors. The surroundings began to grow strangely familiar, and suddenly I recognized them. We were in the great burial vaults below the castle, where the barons Kralitz were ceremoniously entombed. Each baron had been placed in his stone casket in his separate chamber, and each chamber lay, like beads on a necklace, adjacent to the next, so that we proceeded from the farthermost tombs of the early barons Kralitz toward the unoccupied vaults. By immemorial custom, each tomb lay bare, an empty mausoleum, until the time had come for its use, when the great stone coffin, with a memorial inscription carved upon it, would be carried to its place. It was fitting, indeed, for the secret of Kralitz to be hidden here. Abruptly I realized that I was alone, save for the bearded man with the disfiguring scar. The others had vanished, and deep in my thoughts I had not missed them. My companion stretched out his black-swathed arm and halted my progress, and I turned to him questioningly. He said in his sonorous voice, "I must leave you now. I must go back to my own place." And he pointed to the way whence we had come. I nodded, for I had already recognized my companions for what they were. I knew that each Baron Kralitz had been laid in his tomb, only to arise as a monstrous thing neither dead nor alive, to descend into the cavern below and take part in the evil Saturnalia. I realized, too, that with the approach of dawn they had returned to their stone coffins, to lie in a death-like trance until the setting sun should bring brief liberation. My own occult studies had enabled me to recognize these dreadful manifestations. I bowed to my companion, and would have proceeded on my way to the upper parts of the castle, but he barred my path. He shook his head slowly, his scar hideous in the phosphorescent gloom. I said, "May I not go yet?" He stared at me with tortured, smouldering eyes that had looked into hell itself, and he pointed to what lay beside me. And in a flash of nightmare realization, I knew the secret of the Curse of Kralitz. There came to me the knowledge that made my brain a frightful thing in which shapes of darkness would ever swirl and scream, the dreadful comprehension of when each Baron Kralitz was initiated into the Brotherhood of Blood. I knew that no coffin had ever been placed unoccupied in the tombs, and I read upon the stone sarcophagus at my feet the inscription that made my doom known to me. My own name, France, 21st Baron Kralitz.
The end. Subscribe for more at storiesoffuturespast.substack.com. And now for the next story.
The Tree of Life by C.L. Moore. A Tale of Northwest Smith. Originally published in Weird Tales, October 1936. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Over time-ruined Ilar, the searching plains swooped and circled. Northwest Smith, peering up at them with a steel-plate stare from the shelter of a half-collapsed temple, thought of vultures wheeling above carrion. All day long now they had been raking these ruins for him. Presently, he knew, thirst would begin to parch his throat and hunger to gnaw at him. There was neither food nor water in these ancient Martian ruins, and he knew that it could be only a matter of time before the urgencies of his own body would drive him out to signal those wheeling patrol ships and trade his hard-won liberty for food and drink. He crouched lower under the shadow of the temple arch and cursed the accuracy of the patrol gunner whose flame blast had caught his dodging ship just at the edge of Ilar's ruins. Presently it occurred to him that in most Martian temples of the ancient days an ornamental well had stood in the outer court for the benefit of wayfarers. Of course, all water in it would be 1,000,000 years dry now, but for lack of anything better to do, he rose from his seat at the edge of the collapsed central dome and made his cautious way by still intact corridors toward the front of the temple. He paused in a tangle of wreckage at the courtyard's edge and looked out across the sun-drenched expanse of pavement toward that ornate well that once had served travelers who passed by here in the days when Mars was a green planet. It was an unusually elaborate well, and amazingly well preserved. Its rim had been inlaid with a mosaic pattern whose symbolism must once have borne deep meaning, and above it, in a great fan of time-defying bronze, an elaborate grille-work portrayed the inevitable tree of life pattern which so often appeared in the symbolism of the three worlds. Smith looked at it a bit incredulously from his shelter. It was so miraculously preserved amidst all this chaos of broken stone, casting a delicate tracery of shadow on the sunny pavement as perfectly as it must have done 1,000,000 years ago when dusty travellers paused here to drink. He could picture them filing in at noontime through the great gates that— The vision vanished abruptly as his questing eyes made the circle of the ruined walls. There had been no gate. He could not find a trace of it anywhere round the outer wall of the court. The only entrance here, as nearly as he could tell from the foundations that remained, had been the door in whose ruins he now stood. Queer. This must have been a private court, then, its great grille-crowned well reserved for the use of the priests. Or wait, had there not been a priest, King Ilar, after whom the city was named? A wizard king, so legend said, who ruled temple as well as palace with an iron hand. This elaborately patterned well, of material royal enough to withstand the weight of ages, might well have been sacrosanct for the use of that long-dead monarch. It might— Across the sun-bright pavement swept the shadow of a plane. Smith dodged back into deeper hiding while the ship circled low of the courtyard. And it was then, as he crouched against a crumbled wall and waited, motionless, for the danger to pass, that he became aware for the first time of a sound that startled him so that he could scarcely credit his ears. A recurrent sound, choked and sorrowful. The sound of a woman sobbing. The incongruity of it made him forgetful for a moment of the peril hovering overhead in the sun-hot outdoors. The dimness of the temple ruins became a living and vital place for that moment, throbbing with the sound of tears. He looked about, half in incredulity, wondering if hunger and thirst were playing tricks on him already, or if these broken halls might be haunted by a 1,000,000-years-old sorrow that wept along the corridors to drive its hearers mad. There were tales of such haunters in some of Mars's older ruins. The hair prickled faintly at the back of his neck as he laid a hand on the butt of his force gun and commenced a cautious prowl toward the source of the muffled noise. Presently he caught a flash of white, luminous in the gloom of these ruined walls, and went forward with soundless steps, eyes narrowed in the effort to make out what manner of creature this might be that wept alone in time-forgotten ruins. It was a woman. Or it had the dim outlines of a woman, huddled against an angle of fallen walls and veiled in a fabulous shower of long dark hair. But there was something uncannily odd about her. He could not focus his pale stare upon her outlines. She was scarcely more than a luminous blot of whiteness in the gloom, shimmering with a look of unreality which the sound of her sobs denied. Before he could make up his mind just what to do, something must have warned the weeping girl that she was no longer alone, for the sound of her tears checked suddenly, and she lifted her head, turning to him a face no more distinguishable than her body's outlines. He made no effort to resolve the blurred features into visibility, for out of that luminous mask burned two eyes that caught his with an almost perceptible impact, and gripped them in a stare from which he could not have turned if he would. They were the most amazing eyes he had ever met, coloured like moonstone, milkily translucent, so that they looked almost blind. And that magnetic stare held him motionless. In the instant that she gripped him with that fixed, moonstone look, he felt oddly as if a tangible bond were taut between them. Then she spoke, and he wondered if his mind, after all, had begun to give way in the haunted loneliness of dead Ilar, for though the words she spoke fell upon his ears in a gibberish of meaningless sounds, yet in his brain a message formed with a clarity that far transcended the halting communication of words. and her milkily coloured eyes bored into his with a fierce intensity. "I'm lost! I'm lost!" wailed the voice in his brain. A rush of sudden tears brimmed the compelling eyes, veiling their brilliance, and he was free again with that clouding of the moonstone surfaces. Her voice wailed, but the words were meaningless, and no knowledge formed in his brain to match them. Stiffly, he stepped back a pace and looked down at her, a feeling of helpless incredulity rising within him, for he still could not focus directly upon the shining whiteness of her, and nothing save those moonstone eyes were clear to him. The girl sprang to her feet and rose on tiptoe, gripping his shoulders with urgent hands. Again the blind intensity of her eyes took hold of his with a force almost as tangible as the clutch of her hands. Again that stream of intelligence poured into his brain, strongly, pleadingly. "Please, please take me back. I'm so frightened. I can't find my way. Oh, please." He blinked down at her, his dazed mind gradually realizing the basic facts of what was happening. Obviously, her milky, unseeing eyes held a magnetic power that carried her thoughts to him without the need of a common speech. And they were the eyes of a powerful mind, the outlets from which a stream of fierce energy poured into his brain. Yet the words they conveyed were the words of a terrified and helpless girl. A strong sense of weariness was rising in him as he considered the incongruity of speech and power, both of which were beating upon him more urgently with every breath. The mind of a forceful and strong-willed woman, carrying the sobs of a frightened girl. There was no sincerity in it. "Please, please," cried her impatience in his brain. "Help me, guide me back." "Back where?" he heard his own voice asking. "The tree," wailed that queer speech in his brain, while gibberish was all his ears heard, and the moonstone stare transfixed him strongly. "The tree of life! Oh, take me back to the shadow of the tree." A vision of the grill-ornamented well leapt into his memory. It was the only tree symbol he could think of just then. But what possible connection could there be between the well and the lost girl, if she was lost? Another wail in that unknown tongue, another anguished shake of his shoulders, brought a sudden resolution to his groping mind. There could be no harm in leading her back to the well, to whose grill she must surely be referring, and strong curiosity was growing in his mind. Much more than met the eye was concealed in this queer incident, and a wild guess had flashed through his mind that perhaps she might have come from some subterranean world into which the well descended. It would explain her luminous pallor, if not her blurriness, and, too, her eyes did not seem to function in the light. There was a much more incredible explanation of her presence, but he was not to know it for a few minutes yet. "Come along," he said, taking the clutching hands gently from his shoulders. "I'll lead you to the well." She sighed in a deep gust of relief and dropped her compelling eyes from his, murmuring in that strange, gabbling tongue that must have been thanks. He took her by the hand and turned toward the ruined archway of the door. Against his fingers her flesh was cool and firm. To the touch she was tangible, but even thus near, his eyes refused to focus upon the cloudy opacity of her body, the dark blur of her streaming hair. Nothing but those burning, blinded eyes were strong enough to pierce the veil that parted them. She stumbled along at his side over the rough floor of the temple, saying nothing more, panting with eagerness to return to her incomprehensible tree. How much of that eagerness was assumed, Smith still could not be quite sure. When they reached the door, he halted her for a moment, scanning the sky for danger. Apparently the ships had finished with this quarter of the city, for he could see 2 or 3 of them half a mile away, hovering low over Ilar's northern section. He could risk it without much peril. he led the girl cautiously out into the sun-hot court. She could not have known by sight that they neared the well, but when they were within 20 paces of it, she flung up her blurred head suddenly and tugged at his hand. It was she who led him that last stretch which parted the two from the well. In the sun, the shadow tracery of the grille's symbolic pattern lay vividly outlined on the ground. The girl gave a little gasp of delight. She dropped his hand and ran forward 3 short steps and plunged into the very centre of that shadowy pattern on the ground. And what happened then was too incredible to believe. The pattern ran over her like a garment, curving to the curve of her body in the way all shadows do. But as she stood there, striped and laced with the darkness of it, there came a queer shifting in the lines of black tracery, a subtle, inexplicable movement to one side, and with that motion she vanished. It was exactly as if that shifting had moved her out of one world into another. Stupidly, Smith stared at the spot from which she had disappeared. Then several things happened almost simultaneously. The zoom of a plane broke suddenly into the quiet. A black shadow dipped low over the rooftops, and Smith, too late, realized that he stood defenseless in full view of the searching ships. There was only one way out, and that was too fantastic to put faith in, but he had no time to hesitate. With one leap he plunged full into the midst of the shadow of the Tree of Life. Its tracery flowed around him, moulding its pattern to his body, and outside the boundaries everything executed a queer little sidewise dip and slipped in the most extraordinary manner, like an optical illusion, into quite another scene. There was no intervention of blankness. It was as if he looked through the bars of a grill upon a picture which without warning slipped sidewise, while between the bars appeared another scene, a curious, dim landscape, grey as if with the twilight of early evening. The air had an oddly thickened look, through which he saw the quiet trees and the flower-spangled grass of the place with a queer, unreal blending, like the landscape in a tapestry, all its outlines blurred. In the midst of this tapestried twilight, the burning whiteness of the girl he had followed blazed like a flame. She had paused a few steps away, and stood waiting, apparently quite sure that he would come after. He grinned a little to himself as he realized it, knowing that curiosity must almost certainly have driven him in her wake, even if the necessity for shelter had not compelled his following. She was clearly visible now, in this thickened dimness, visible and very lovely, and a little unreal. She shone with a burning clarity, the only vivid thing in the whole twilit world. Eyes upon that blazing whiteness, Smith stepped forward, scarcely realizing that he had moved. Slowly he crossed the dark grass toward her. That grass was soft underfoot, and thick with small, low-blooming flowers of a shining pallor. Botticelli painted such spangled swords for the feet of his angels. Upon it the girl's bare feet gleamed whiter than the blossoms. She wore no garment but the royal mantle of her hair, sweeping about her in a cloak of shining darkness that had a queer, unreal tinge of purple in that low light. It brushed her ankles in its fabulous length. From the hood of it she watched Smith coming toward her, a smile on her pale mouth and a light blazing in the depths of her moonstone eyes. She was not blind now, nor frightened. She stretched out her hand to him confidently. "It is my turn now to lead you," she smiled. As before, the words were gibberish, but the penetrating stare of those strange white eyes gave them a meaning in the depths of his brain. Automatically his hand went out to hers. He was a little dazed, and her eyes were very compelling. Her fingers twined in his, and she set off over the flowery grass, pulling him beside her. He did not ask where they were going. Lost in the dreamy spell of the still grey enchanted place,
he felt no need for words. He was beginning to see more clearly in the odd, blurring twilight that ran the outlines of things together in that queer, tapestried manner, and he puzzled in a futile, muddled way as he went on over that sort of land he had come into. Overhead was darkness, paling into twilight near the ground, so that when he looked up he was staring into bottomless deeps of starless night. Trees and flowering shrubs and the flower-starred grass stretched emptily about them in the thick, confusing gloom of the place. He could see only a little distance through that dim air. It was as if they walked a strip of tapestried twilight in some unlighted dream, and the girl, with her lovely, luminous body and richly coloured robe of hair, was like a woman in a tapestry too, unreal and magical. After a while, when he had become a little adjusted to the queerness of the whole scene, he began to notice furtive movements in the shrubs and trees they passed. Things flickered too swiftly for him to catch their outlines, but from the tail of his eye he was aware of motion, and somehow of eyes that watched. The sensation was a familiar one to him, and he kept an uneasy gaze on those shiftings in the shrubbery as they went on. Presently he caught a watcher in full view between bush and tree, and saw that it was a man, a little, furtive, dark-skinned man who dodged hastily back into cover again before Smith's eyes could do more than take in the fact of his existence. After that, he knew what to expect, and could make them out more easily. Little, darting people with big eyes that shone with a queer, sorrowful darkness from their small, frightened faces as they scuttled through the bushes, dodging always just out of plain sight among the leaves. He could hear the soft rustle of their passage, and once or twice, when they passed near a clump of shrubbery, he thought he caught the echo of little whispering calls, gentle as a rustle of leaves, and somehow full of a strange warning note, so clear that he caught it even amid the murmur of their speech. Warning calls, and little furtive hiders in the leaves, and a landscape of tapestried, blurring, carpeted with Botticelli flower-strewn sward. It was all a dream. He felt quite sure of that. It was a long while before curiosity awakened in him sufficiently to make him break the stillness, but at last he asked dreamily, "Where are we going?" The girl seemed to understand that without the necessity of the bond her hypnotic eyes made, for she turned and caught his eyes in a white stare and answered, "To Thag. Thag desires you." "What is Thag?" In answer to that, she launched without preliminary upon a little sing-song monologue of explanation, whose stereotyped formula made him faintly uneasy with the thought that it must have been made very often to attain the status of a set speech, made to many men, perhaps, whom Thag had desired. And what became of them afterward, he wondered. But the girl was speaking. "Many ages ago, there dwelt in Ilar the great King Ilar, for whom the city was named. He was a magician of mighty power, but not mighty enough to fulfill all his ambitions. So by his arts he called up out of darkness the being known as Thag, and with him struck a bargain. By that bargain Thag was to give of his limitless power, serving Ilar all the days of Ilar's life, and in return the king was to create a land for Thag's dwelling place, and people it with slaves, and furnish a priestess to tend Thag's needs. This is that land. I am that priestess, the latest of a long line of women born to serve Thag. The tree people are his lesser servants. I have spoken softly, so that the tree people do not hear, for to them Thag is the centre and focus of creation, the end and beginning of all life. But to you I have told the truth." "But what does Thag want of me?" "It is not for Thag's servants to question Thag." "Then what becomes, afterward, of the men Thag desires?" he pursued.
You must ask Thag that." She turned her eyes away as she spoke, snapping the mental bond that had flowed between them with a suddenness that left Smith dizzy. He went on at her side more slowly, pulling back a little on the tug of her fingers. By degrees, the sense of dreaminess was fading, and alarm began to stir in the deeps of his mind. After all, there was no reason why he need let this blank-eyed priestess lead him up to the very maw of her god. She had lured him into this land by what he knew now to have been a trick. Might she not have worse tricks than that in store for him? She held him, after all, by nothing stronger than the clasp of her fingers, if he could keep his eyes turned from hers. Therein lay her real power, but he could fight it if he chose. And he began to hear more clearly than ever the queer note of warning in the rustling whispers of the tree folk who still fluttered in and out of sight among the leaves. The twilight place had taken on menace and evil. Suddenly he made up his mind. He stopped, breaking the clasp of the girl's hand. "I'm not going," he said. She swung around in a sweep of richly tinted hair, words jetting from her in a gush of incoherence, but he dared not meet her eyes, and they conveyed no meaning to him. Resolutely he turned away, ignoring her voice, and set out to retrace the way they had come. She called after him once, in a high, clear voice that somehow held a note as warning as that in the rustling voices of the tree people, but he kept on doggedly, not looking back. She laughed then, sweetly and scornfully, a laugh that echoed uneasily in his mind long after the sound of it had died upon the twilit air. After a while he glanced back over one shoulder, half expecting to see the luminous dazzle of her body still glowing in the dim glade where he had left her, but the blurred tapestry landscape was quite empty. He went on in the midst of a silence so deep it hurt his ears, and in a solitude unhaunted even by the shy presences of the tree folk. They had vanished with the fire-bright girl, and the whole twilight land was empty save for himself. He plodded on across the dark grass, crushing the upturned flower faces under his boots, and asking himself wearily if he could be mad. There seemed little other explanation for this hushed and tapestried solitude that had swallowed him up. In that thunderous quiet, in that deathly solitude, he went on. When he had walked for what seemed to him much longer than it should have taken to reach his starting point, and still no sign of an exit appeared, he began to wonder if there were any way out of the grey land of Thag. For the first time he realized that he had come through no tangible gateway. He had only stepped out of a shadow, and, now that he thought of it, there were no shadows here. The greyness swallowed everything up, leaving the landscape oddly flat, like a badly drawn picture. He looked about helplessly, quite lost now, and not sure in what direction he should be facing, for there was nothing here by which to know directions. The trees and shrubs and the starry grass still stretched about him, uncertainly outlined in that changeless dusk. They seemed to go on forever. But he plodded ahead, unwilling to stop because of a queer tension in the air, somehow as if all the blurred trees and shrubs were waiting in breathless anticipation, centering upon his stumbling figure. But all trace of animate life had vanished with the disappearance of the priestess's white glowing figure. Head down, paying little heed to where he was going, he went on over the flowery sward. An odd sense of voids about him startled Smith at last out of his lethargic plodding. He lifted his head. He stood just at the edge of a line of trees, dim and indistinct in the unchanging twilight. Beyond them, he came to himself with a jerk and stared incredulously. Beyond them, the grass ran down to nothingness, merging by imperceptible degrees into a streaked and arching void. Not the sort of emptiness into which a material body could fall, but a solid nothing, curving up toward the dark zenith as the inside of a sphere curves. No physical thing could have entered there. It was too utterly void, an inviolable emptiness which no force could invade. He stared up along the inward arch of that curving, impassable wall. Here, then, was the edge of the queer land Ilar had wrested out of space itself. This arch must be the curving of solid space which had been bent awry to enclose the magical land. There was no escape this way. He could not even bring himself to approach any nearer to that streaked and arching blank. He could not have said why, but it awoke in him an inner disquiet so strong that after a moment's staring he turned his eyes away. Presently he shrugged and set off along the inside of the line of trees which parted him from the space wall. Perhaps there might be a break somewhere. It was a forlorn hope, but the best that offered. Wearily he stumbled on over the flowery grass. How long he had gone on along that almost imperceptibly curving line of border he could not have said, but after a timeless interval of grey solitude he gradually became aware that a tiny rustling and whispering among the leaves had been growing louder by degrees for some time. He looked up. In and out among the trees which bordered that solid wall of nothingness, little indistinguishable figures were flitting. The tree-men had returned. Queerly grateful for their presence, he went on a bit more cheerfully, paying no heed to their timid dartings to and fro, for Smith was wise in the ways of wild life. Presently, when they saw how little heed he paid them, they began to grow bolder, their whispers louder, and among those rustling voices he thought he was beginning to catch threads of familiarity. Now and again a word reached his ears that he seemed to recognize, lost amidst the gibberish of their speech. He kept his head down and his hands quiet, plodding along with a cunning stillness that began to bear results. From the corner of his eye he could see that a little dark treeman had darted out from cover and paused midway between bush and tree to inspect the queer, tall stranger. Nothing happened to this daring venturer, and soon another risked a pause in the open to stare at the quiet walker among the trees. In a little while a small crowd of the tree people were moving slowly parallel with his course, staring with all the avid curiosity of wild things at Smith's plodding figure. And among them the rustling whispers grew louder. Presently the ground dipped down into a little hollow ringed with trees. It was a bit darker here than it had been on the higher level, and as he went down the slope of its side, he saw that among the underbrush which filled it were cunningly hidden huts twined together out of the living bushes. Obviously the hollow was a tiny village where the tree folk dwelt. He was surer of this when they began to grow bolder as he went down into the dimness of the place. The whispers shrilled a little, and the boldest among his watchers ran almost at his elbow, twittering their queer broken speech in hushed syllables, whose familiarity still bothered him with its haunting echo of words he knew. When he had reached the centre of the hollow, he became aware that the little folk had spread out in a ring to surround him. Wherever he looked, their small, anxious faces and staring eyes confronted him. He grinned to himself, and came to a halt, waiting gravely. None of them seemed quite brave enough to constitute himself spokesman, but among several a hurried whispering broke out, which he caught the words "Thag" and "Danger" and "Beware." He recognized the meaning of these words without placing in his mind their origins in some tongue he knew. He knit his sun-bleached brows and concentrated harder, striving to wrest from that curious murmuring whisper some hint of its original root. He had a smattering of more tongues than he could have counted offhand, and it was hard to place these scattered words among any one speech. But the word thag had a sound like that of the very ancient dry-land tongue, which upon Mars is considered at once the oldest and most uncouth of all the planet's languages. And with that clue to guide him, he presently began to catch other syllables which were remotely like syllables from the dry-land speech. They were almost unrecognizable, far, far more ancient than the very oldest versions of the tongue he had ever heard repeated, almost primitive in their crudity and simplicity. And for a moment the sheerest awe came over him as he realized the significance of what he listened to. The dryland race today is a handful of semi-brutes, degenerate from the ages of past time when they were a mighty people at the apex of an almost forgotten glory. That day is millions of years gone now, too far in the past to have record save in the vaguest folklore. Yet here was a people who spoke the rudiments of that race's tongue, as it must have been spoken in the race's dim beginnings, perhaps 1,000,000 years earlier even than that immemorial time of their triumph. The reeling of millenniums set Smith's mind a-whirl with the effort at compassing their span. There was another connotation in the speaking of that tongue by these timid bush-dwellers too. It must mean that the forgotten wizard-king, Ilar, had peopled his sinister twilight land with the ancestors of today's dryland dwellers. If they shared the same tongue, they must share the same lineage, and humanity's remorseless adaptability had done the rest. It had been no kinder here than in the outside world, where the ancient plainsmen who had roamed Mars's green prairies had dwindled with their dying plains, degenerating at last into a shrunken, leather-skinned bestiality. For here that same race root had declined into these tiny, slinking creatures, with their dusky skins and great staring eyes, and their voices that never rose above a whisper. What tragedies must lie behind that gradual degeneration? All about him the whispers still ran. He was beginning to suspect that though countless ages of hiding and murmuring, those voices must have lost the ability to speak aloud. And he wondered with a little inward chill what terror it was which had transformed a free and fearless people into these tiny wild things whispering in the underbrush. The little anxious voices had shrilled into vehemence now, all of them chattering together in their queer, soft, rustling whispers. Looking back later upon that timeless space he had passed in the hollow, Smith remembered it as some curious nightmare, dimness and tapestried blurring, and a hush like death over the whole twilight land, and the timid voices whispering, eloquent with terror and warning. He groped back among his memories and brought forth a phrase or two remembered from long ago, an archaic rendering of the immemorial tongue they spoke. It was the simplest version he could remember of the complex speech now used, but he knew that to them it must sound fantastically strange. Instinctively he whispered as he spoke it, feeling like an actor in a play as he mouthed the ancient idiom. I cannot understand. Speak more slowly." A torrent of words greeted this rendering of their tongue. Then there was a great deal of hushing and hissing, and presently 2 or 3 between them began laboriously to recite an involved speech, 1 syllable at a time. Always 2 or more shared the task. Never in his converse with them did he address anyone directly. Ages of terror had bred all directness out of them. "Thag," they said, "Thag the terrible, Thag the omnipotent, Thag the unescapable. Beware of Thag." For a moment Smith stood quiet, grinning down at them despite himself. There must not be too much of intelligence left among this branch of the race either, for surely such a warning was superfluous. Yet, they had mastered their agonies of timidity to give it. All virtue could not yet have been bred out of them then. They still had kindness and a sort of desperate courage rooted deep in fear. "What is Thag?" he managed to inquire, voicing the archaic syllables uncertainly. And they must have understood the meaning, if not the phraseology, for another spate of whispered tumult burst from the clustering tribe. Then, as before, several took up the task of answering. "Thag, Thag, the end and the beginning, the centre of creation. When Thag breathes, the world trembles. The earth was made for Thag's dwelling place. All things are Thag's. Oh, beware, beware!" This much he pieced together out of their diffuse whisperings, catching up the fragments of words he knew and fitting them into the pattern. What is the danger?" he managed to ask. "Thag hungers. Thag must be fed. It is we who feed him. But there are times when he desires other food than us. It is then he sends his priestess forth to lure food in. Oh, beware of Thag." "You mean, then, that she, the priestess, brought me in for food?" A chorus of grave, murmuring affirmatives. "Then why did she leave me?" "There is no escape from Thag. Thag is the centre of creation. All things are Thag's. When he calls, you must answer. When he hungers, he will have you. Beware of Thag." Smith considered that for a moment in silence. In the main he felt confident that he had understood their warning correctly, and he had little reason to doubt that they knew whereof they spoke. Thag might not be the centre of the universe, but if they said he could call a victim from anywhere in the land, Smith was not disposed to doubt it. The priestess's willingness to let him leave her unhindered, yes, even her scornful laughter as he looked back, told the same story. Whatever Thag might be, his power in this land could not be doubted. He made up his mind suddenly to what he must do, and turned to the breathlessly waiting little folk. "Which way lies Thag?" he asked. A score of dark thin arms pointed. Smith turned his head speculative toward the spot they indicated. In this changeless twilight all sense of direction had long since left him, but he marked the line as well as he could by the formation of the trees, then turned to the little people with a ceremonious farewell rising to his lips. "My thanks for—" he began, to be interrupted by a chorus of whispering cries of protest. They seemed to sense his intention, and their pleadings were frantic. A panic anxiety for him glowed upon every little terrified face turned up to his, and their eyes were wide with protest and terror. Helplessly he looked down. I must go," he tried stumblingly to say. "My only chance is to take Thag unawares, before he sends for me." He could not know if they understood. Their chattering went on undiminished, and they even went so far as to lay tiny hands on him, as if they would prevent him by force from seeking out the terror of their lives. "No, no, no," they wailed murmurously. "You do not know what it is you seek. You do not know Thag. Stay here. Beware of Thag." A little prickling of unease went down Smith's back as he listened. Thag must be very terrible indeed if even half this alarm had foundation. And to be quite frank with himself, he would greatly have preferred to remain here in the hidden quiet of the hollow, with its illusion of shelter, for as long as he was allowed to stay. But he was not of the stuff that yields very easily to its own terrors, and hope burned strongly in him still. So he squared his broad shoulders and turned resolutely in the direction the tree-folk had indicated. When they saw that he meant to go, their protests sank to a wail of bitter grieving. With that sound moaning behind him, he went up out of the hollow, like a man setting forth to the music of his own dirge. A few of the bravest went with him a little way, flitting through the underbrush and darting from tree to tree in a timidity so deeply ingrained that even when no immediate peril threatened, they dared not go openly through the twilight. Their presence was comforting to Smith as he went on. A futile desire to help the little terror-ridden tribe was rising in him, a useless gratitude for their warning and their friendliness, their genuine grieving at his departure, and their odd paradoxical bravery even in the midst of hereditary terror. But he knew that he could do nothing for them, when he was not at all sure he could even save himself. Something of their panic had communicated itself to him, and he advanced with a sinking at the pit of his stomach. Fear of the unknown is so poignant a thing, feeding on its own terror, that he found his hands beginning to shake a little, and his throat going dry as he went on. The rustling and whispering among the bushes dwindled as his followers one by one dropped away, the bravest staying the longest, but even they failing in courage as Smith advanced steadily in that direction from which all their lives they had been taught to turn their faces. Presently he realized that he was alone once more. He went on more quickly, anxious to come face to face with this horror of the twilight, and dispel at least the fearfulness of its mystery. The silence was like death. Not a breeze stirred the leaves, and the only sound was his own breathing, the heavy thud of his own heart. Somehow he felt sure that he was coming nearer to his goal. The hush seemed to confirm it. He loosened the force gun at his thigh. In that changeless twilight the ground was sloping down once more into a broader hollow. He descended slowly, every sense alert for danger, not knowing if Thag was beast or human or elemental, visible or invisible. The trees were beginning to thin. He knew that he had almost reached his goal. He paused at the edge of the last line of trees. A clearing spread out before him at the bottom of the hollow, quiet in the dim, translucent air. He could focus directly upon no outlines anywhere, for the tapestried blurring of the place. But when he saw what stood in the very centre of the clearing, he stopped dead still, like one turned to stone, and a shock of utter cold went chilling through him. Yet he could not have said why. For in the clearing's centre stood the Tree of Life. He had met the symbol too often in patterns and designs not to recognize it, but here that fabulous thing was living, growing, actually springing up from a rooted firmness in the spangled grass that any tree might spring. Yet it could not be real. Its thin brown trunk, of no recognizable substance, smooth and gleaming, mounted in the traditional spiral. Its 12 fantastically curving branches arched delicately outward from the central stem. It was bare of leaves, no foliage masked the serpentine brown spiral of the trunk, but at the tip of each symbolic branch flowered a blossom of bloody rose so vivid he could scarcely focus his dazzled eyes upon them. This tree alone of all objects in the dim land was sharply distinct to the eye, terribly distinct, remorselessly clear. No words can describe the amazing menace that dwelt among its branches. Smith's flesh crept as he stared, yet he could not for all his staring make out why peril was so eloquent there. To all appearances here stood only a fabulous symbol miraculously come to life, yet danger breathed out from it so strongly that Smith felt the hair lifting on his neck as he stared. It was no ordinary danger. A nameless, choking, paralyzed panic was swelling in his throat as he gazed upon the perilous beauty of the tree. Somehow the arches and curves of its branches seemed to limn a pattern so dreadful that his heart beat faster as he gazed upon it. but he could not guess why, though somehow the answer was hovering just out of reach of his conscious mind. From that first glimpse of it, his instincts shuddered like a shying stallion, yet reason still looked in vain for an answer. Nor was the tree merely a vegetable growth. It was alive, terribly, ominously alive. He could not have said how he knew that, for it stood motionless in its empty clearing, not a branch trembling, yet in its immobility more awfully vital than any animate thing. The very sight of it woke in Smith an insane urging to flight, to put worlds between himself and this inexplicably dreadful thing. Crazy impulses stirred in his brain, coming to insane birth at the calling of the tree's peril. The desperate need to shut out the sight of that thing that was blasphemy, to put out his own sight rather than gaze longer upon the perilous grace of its branches, to slit his own throat that he might not need to dwell in the same world which housed so frightful a sight as the tree. All this was a mad battering in his brain. The strength of him was enough to isolate it in a far corner of his consciousness, where it seethed and shrieked half-heeded while he turned the cool control which the spaceway's life had taught him to the solution of this urgent question. But even so, his hand was moist and shaking on his gun butt, and the breath rasped in his dry throat. Why, he asked himself in a determined groping after steadiness, should the mere sight of a tree, even so fabulous a one as this, rouse that insane panic in the gazer? What peril could dwell invisibly in a tree so frightful that the living horror of it could drive a man mad with the very fact of its unseen presence? He clenched his teeth hard and stared resolutely at that terrible beauty in the clearing, fighting down the sick panic that rose in his throat as his eyes forced themselves to dwell upon the tree. Gradually, the revulsion subsided. After a nightmare of striving, he mustered the strength to force it down far enough to allow reason's entry once more. Sternly holding down that frantic terror under the surface of consciousness, he stared resolutely at the tree, and he knew that this was Thag. It could be nothing else, for surely two such dreadful things could not dwell in one land. It must be Thag, and he could understand now the immemorial terror in which the tree folk held it, but he did not yet grasp in what way it threatened them physically. The inexplicable dreadfulness of it was a menace to the mind's very existence, but surely a rooted tree, however terrible to look at, could wield little actual danger. As he reasoned, his eyes were seeking restlessly among the branches, searching for the answer to their dreadfulness. After all, this thing wore the aspect of an old pattern, and in that pattern there was nothing dreadful. The tree of life had made up the design upon that well-top in Ilar through whose shadow he had entered here, and nothing in that bronze grille-work had roused terror. Then why? What living menace dwelt invisibly among these branches to twist them into curves of horror? A fragment of old verse drifted through his mind as he stared in perplexity. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? And for the first time the true significance of a fearful symmetry broke upon him. Truly a more than human agency must have arched these subtle curves so delicately into dreadfulness, into such an awful beauty that the very sight of it made those atavistic terrors he was so sternly holding down leap in a gibbering terror. A tremor rippled over the tree. Smith froze rigid, staring with startled eyes. No breath of wind had stirred through the clearing, but the tree was moving with a slow, serpentine grace, writhing its branches leisurely in a horrible travesty of voluptuous enjoyment. and upon their tips the blood-red flowers were spreading like cobras' hoods, swelling and stretching their petals out, and glowing with a hue so eye-piercingly vivid that it transcended the bounds of colour, and blazed forth like pure light. But it was not towards Smith that they stirred. They were arching out from the central trunk toward the far side of the clearing. After a moment, Smith tore his eyes away from the indescribably dreadful flexibility of those branches, and looked to see the cause of their writhing. A blaze of luminous white had appeared among the trees across the clearing. The priestess had returned. He watched her pacing slowly toward the tree, walking with a precise and delicate grace as liquidly lovely as the motion of the tree. Her fabulous hair swung down about her in a swaying robe that rippled at every step away from the moon-white beauty of her body. Straight toward the tree she paced, and all the blossoms glowed more vividly at her nearness, the branches stretching toward her, rippling with eagerness. Priestess though she was, he could not believe that she was going to come within touch of that tree, the very sight of which roused such a panic instinct of revulsion in every fibre of him. But she did not swerve or slow in her advance, walking delicately over the flowery grass, arrogantly luminous in the twilight, so that her body was the centre and focus of any landscape she walked in. She neared her horribly eager god. Now she was under the tree, and its trunk had writhed down over her, and she was lifting her arms like a girl to her lover. With a gliding slowness, the flame-tipped branches slid around her. In that incredible embrace she stood immobile for a long moment, the tree arching down with all its curling limbs, the girl straining upward, her head thrown back, and the mantle of her hair swinging free of her body as she lifted her face to the quivering blossoms. The branches gathered her closer in their embrace. Now the blossoms arched near, curving down all about her, touching her very gently, twisting their blazing faces toward the focus of her moon-white body. One poised directly above her face, trembled, brushed her mouth lightly, and the tree's tremor ran unbroken through the body of the girl it clasped. The incredible dreadfulness of that embrace was suddenly more than Smith could bear. All his terrors, crushed down with so stern a self-control, without warning burst all bounds and rushed over him in a flood of blind revulsion. A whimper choked up in his throat, and quite involuntarily he swung round and plunged into the shielding trees, hands to his eyes in a futile effort to blot out the sight of lovely horror behind him, whose vividness was burnt upon his very brain. Heedlessly he blundered through the trees, no thought in his terror-blank mind save the necessity to run, until he could run no more. He had given up all attempt at reason and rationality. He no longer cared why the beauty of the tree was so dreadful. He only knew that until all space lay between him and its symmetry, he must run and run and run. What brought that frenzied madness to an end, he never knew. When sanity returned to him, he was lying face down on the flower-spangled sward, in a silence so deep that his ears ached with its heaviness. The grass was cool against his cheek. For a moment he fought the backflow of knowledge into his emptied mind. When it came, the memory of that horror he had fled from, he started up with a wild thing's swiftness and glared around pale-eyed into the unchanging dusk. He was alone. Not even a rustle in the leaves spoke of the tree-folk's presence. For a moment he stood there alert, wondering what had roused him, wondering what would come next. He was not left long in doubt. The answer was shrilling very, very faintly through that aching quiet, an infinitesimally tiny, unthinkably far-away murmur, which yet pierced his eardrums with the sharpness of tiny needles. Breathless, he strained in listening. Swiftly the sound grew louder. It deepened upon the silence, sharpened and shrilled until the thin blade of it was vibrating in the centre of his innermost brain. And still it grew, swelling louder and louder through the twilight world in cadences that were rounding into a queer sort of music, and taking on such an unbearable sweetness that Smith pressed his hands over his ears in a futile attempt to shut the sound away. He could not. It rang in steadily deepening intensities through every fibre of his being, piercing him with thousands of tiny music blades that quivered in his very soul with intolerable beauty. And he thought he sensed in the piercing strength of it a vibration of queer, unnameable power, far mightier than anything ever generated by man, the dim echo of some cosmic dynamo's hum. The sound grew sweeter as it strengthened, with a queer, inexplicable sweetness unlike any music he had ever heard before, rounder and fuller and more complete than any melody made up of separate notes. Stronger and stronger he felt the certainty that it was the song of some mighty power, humming and throbbing and deepening through the twilight until the whole dim land was one trembling reservoir of sound that filled his entire consciousness with its throbbing, driving out all other thoughts and realizations, until he was no more than a shell that vibrated in answer to the calling. For it was a calling. No one could listen to that intolerable sweetness without knowing the necessity to seek its source. Remotely in the back of his mind, Smith remembered the tree folk's warning. "When Thag calls, you must answer." Not consciously did he recall it, for all his consciousness was answering the siren humming in the air, and scarcely realizing that he moved, he had turned toward the source of that calling, stumbling blindly over the flowery sward with no thought in his music-brimmed mind but the need to answer that lovely, power-vibrant summoning. Past him, as he went on, moved other shapes, little and dark-skinned and ecstatic, gripped like himself in the hypnotic melody. The tree folk had forgotten even their inbred fear at Thag's calling, and walked boldly through the open twilight, lost in the wonder of the song. Smith went on with the rest, deaf and blind to the land around him, alive to one thing only, that summons from the siren tune. Unrealizingly, he retraced the course of his frenzied flight, past the trees and bushes he had blundered through, down the slope that led to the tree's hollow, through the thinning of the underbrush to the very edge of the last line of foliage which marked the valley's rim. By now the calling was so unbearably intense, so intolerably sweet, that somehow in its very strength it set free a part of his dazed mind as it passed the limits of audible things and soared into ecstasies which no senses bound. And though it gripped him ever closer in its magic, a sane part of his brain was waking into realization. For the first time alarm came back into his mind, and by slow degrees the world returned about him. He stared stupidly at the grass moving by under his pacing feet. He lifted a dragging head and saw that the trees no longer rose about him, that a twilit clearing stretched away on all sides toward the forest rim which circled it, that the music was singing from some source so near that the tree. Terror leaped within him like a wild thing. The tree, quivering with unbearable clarity in the thick dim air, writhed above him, blossoms blazing with bloody radiance and every branch vibrant and undulant to the tune of that unholy song. Then he was aware of the lovely, luminous whiteness of the priestess swaying forward under the swaying limbs, her hair rippling back from the loveliness of her as she moved. Choked and frenzied with unreasoning terror, he mustered every effort that was in him to turn, to run again like a madman out of that dreadful hollow, to hide himself under the weight of all space from the menace of the tree. And all the while he fought, All the while panic drummed like mad in his brain. His relentless body plodded on straight toward the hideous loveliness of that siren singer towering above him. From the first he had felt subconsciously that it was Thag who called, and now, in the very center of that ocean of vibrant power, he knew. Gripped in the music's magic, he went on. All over the clearing, other hypnotized victims were advancing slowly, with mechanical steps and wide, frantic eyes as the tree folk came helplessly to their god's calling. He watched a group of little dusky sacrifices pace step by step nearer to the tree's vibrant branches. The priestess came forward to meet them with outstretched arms. He saw her take the foremost gently by the hands. Unbelieving, hypnotized with horrified incredulity, he watched her lead the rigid little creature forward under the fabulous tree whose limbs yearned downward like hungry snakes, the great flowers glowing with avid color. He saw the branches twist out and lengthen toward the sacrifice, quivering with eagerness. Then, with a tiger's leap, they darted, and the victim was swept out of the priestess's guiding hands up into the branches that darted round like tangled snakes in the clot that hid him for an instant from view. Smith heard a high, shuddering wail ripple out from that knot of struggling branches, a dreadful cry that held such an infinity of purest horror and understanding that he could not but believe that Thag's victims in the moment of their doom must learn the secret of his horror. After that one frightful cry came silence. In an instant the limbs fell apart again from emptiness. The little savage had melted like smoke among their writhing, too quickly to have been devoured, more as if he had been snatched into another dimension in the instant the hungry limbs hid him. Flame-tipped, avid, they were dipping now toward another victim as the priestess paced serenely forward. And still Smith's rebellious feet were carrying him on, nearer and nearer the writhing peril that towered over his head. The music shrilled like pain. Now he was so close that he could see the hungry flower mouths in terrible detail as they faced round toward him. The limbs quivered and poised like cobras, reached out with a snakish lengthening, down inexorably toward his shuddering helplessness. The priestess was turning her calm white face toward his. Those arcs and changing curves of the branches as they neared were sketching lines of pure horror whose meaning he still could not understand, save that they deepened in dreadfulness as he neared. For the last time that urgent wonder burned up in his mind. Why so simple a thing as this fabulous tree should be infused with such an indwelling terror strong enough to send his innermost soul frantic with revulsion. For the last time, because in that trembling instant, as he waited for their touch, as the music brimmed up with unbearable, brain-wrenching intensity, in that one last moment before the flower mouths seized him, he saw, he understood. With eyes opened at last by the instant's ultimate horror, he saw the real Thag. Dimly he knew that until now the thing had been so frightful that his eyes had refused to register its existence, his brain to acknowledge the possibility of such dreadfulness. It had literally been too terrible to see, though his instinct knew the presence of infinite horror. But now, in the grip of that mad, hypnotic song, in the instant before unbearable terror enfolded him, his eyes opened to full sight, and he saw. That tree was only Thag's outline, sketched three-dimensionally upon the twilight. Its dreadfully curving branches had been no more than Thag's barest contours, yet even they had made his very soul sick with intuitive revulsion. But now seeing the true horror. His mind was too numb to do more than register its presence. Thag, hovering monstrously between earth and heaven, billowing and surging up there in the translucent twilight, tethered to the ground by the tree's bending stem, and reaching ravenously after the hypnotized fodder that his calling brought helpless into his clutches. One by one he snatched them up, one by one absorbed them into the great unseeable horror of his being. That, then, was the reason why they vanished so instantaneously, sucked into the concealing folds of a thing too dreadful for normal eyes to see. The priestess was pacing forward. Above her, the branches arched and leaned. Caught in a timeless paralysis of horror, Smith stared upward into the enormous bulk of Thag, while the music hummed intolerably in his shrinking brain. Thag, the monstrous thing from darkness, called up by Ilar in those long-forgotten times when Mars was a green planet. Foolishly his brain wandered among the ramifications of what had happened so long ago that time itself had forgotten, refusing to recognize the fate that was upon himself. He knew a tingle of respect for the ages-dead wizard who had dared command a being like this to his services. This vast, blind, hovering thing, ravenous for human flesh, indistinguishable even now save in those terrible outlines that sent panic leaping through him with every motion of the tree's fearful symmetry. All this flashed through his dazed mind in the one blinding instant of understanding. Then the priestess's luminous whiteness swam up before his hypnotized stare. Her hands were upon him, gently guiding his mechanical footsteps, very gently leading him forward, into. The writhing branches struck downward, straight for his face, and in one flashing leap the moment's infinite horror galvanized him out of his paralysis. Why, he could not have said. It is not given to many men to know the ultimate essentials of all horror, concentrated into one fundamental unit. To most men it would have had the same paralyzing effect up to the very instant of destruction. But in Smith there must have been a bedrock of subtle violence, an unyielding, inflexible vehemence upon which the structure of his whole life was reared. Few men have it. And when that ultimate intensity of terror struck the basic flint of him, reaching down through mind and soul into the deepest depths of his being, it struck a spark from that inflexible barbarian buried at the roots of him which had force enough to shock him out of his stupor. In the instant of release, his hands swept like an unloosed spring, of its own volition, straight for the butt of his power gun. He was dragging it free as the tree's branches snatched him from its priestess's hand. The fire-coloured blossoms burnt his flesh as they closed around him, the hot branches gripping like the touch of ravenous fingers. The whole tree was hot and throbbing with a dreadful travesty of fleshly life as it whipped him aloft into the hovering bulk of incarnate horror above. In the instantaneous upward leap of the flower-tipped limbs, Smith fought like a demon to free his gun hand from the gripping coils. For the first time, Thag knew rebellion in his very clutches, and the ecstasy of that music which had dinned in Smith's ears so strongly that by now it seemed almost silence, was swooping down a long arc into wrath, and the branches tightened with hot insistency, lifting the rebellious offering into Thag's monstrous, indescribable bulk. But even as they rose, Smith was twisting in their clutch to maneuver his hand into a position from which he could blast that undulant tree trunk into nothingness. He knew intuitively the futility of firing up into Thag's imponderable mass. Thag was not of the world, he knew. The flame blast might well be harmless to that mighty hoverer in the twilight, but at the tree's root, where Thag's essential being merged from the imponderable to the material, rooting in earthly soil, he should be vulnerable, if he were vulnerable at all.
Struggling in the tight, hot coils, breathing the nameless essence of horror, Smith fought to free his hand. The music that had rung so long in his ears was changing as the branches lifted him higher, losing its melody and merging by swift degrees into a hum of vast and vibrant power that deepened in intensity as the limbs drew him upward into Thag's monstrous bulk, the singing force of a thing mightier than any dynamo ever built. Blinded and dazed by the force thundering through every atom of his body, he twisted his hand in one last convulsive effort and fired. He saw the flame leap in a dazzling gush straight for the trunk below. It struck. He heard the sizzle of annihilated matter. He saw the trunk quiver convulsively from the very roots, and the whole fabulous tree shook once with an ominous tremor. But before that tremor could shiver up the branches to him, the hum of the living dynamo which was closing around his body shrilled up arcs of pure intensity into a thundering silence. Then without a moment's warning the world exploded. So instantaneously did all this happen that the gun blast's roar had not yet echoed into silence before a mightier sound than the brain could bear exploded outward from the very center of his own being. Before the awful power of it everything reeled into a shaken oblivion. He felt himself falling. A queer, penetrating light, shining upon his closed eyes, roused Smith by degrees into wakefulness again. He lifted heavy lids and stared upward into the unwinking eye of Mars's racing nearer moon. He lay there, blinking dazedly for a while before enough of memory returned to rouse him. Then he sat up painfully, for every fibre of him ached, and stared round on a scene of the wildest destruction. He lay in the midst of a wide, rough circle which held nothing but powdered stone. About it, rising raggedly in the moving moonlight, the blocks of time-forgotten Ilar loomed. But they were no longer piled one upon another in a rough travesty of the city they once had shaped. Some force, mightier than any of man's explosives, seemed to have hurled them with such violence from their beds that their very atoms had been disrupted by the force of it, crumbling them into dust. And in the very centre of the havoc lay Smith, unhurt. He stared in bewilderment about the moonlight ruins. In the silence it seemed to him that the very air still quivered in shocked vibrations. And as he stared, he realized that no force save one could have wrought such destruction upon the ancient stones. Nor was there any explosive known to man which would have wrought this strange pulverizing havoc upon the blocks of Ilar. That force had hummed unbearably through the living dynamo of Thag, a force so powerful that space itself had bent to enclose it. Suddenly he realized what must have happened. Not Ilar, but Thag himself had warped the walls of space to enfold the twilit world, and nothing but Thag's living power could have held it so bent to segregate the little terror-ridden land inviolate. Then, when the tree's roots parted, Thag's anchorage in the material world failed, and in one great gust of unthinkable energy the warped space walls had ceased to bend. Those arches of solid space had snapped back into their original pattern, hurling the land and all its dwellers into... His mind balked in the effort to picture what must have happened, into what ultimate dimension those denizens must have vanished. Only himself, enfolded deep in Thag's very essence, the intolerable power of the explosion had not touched. So when the warped space curve ceased to be, and Thag's hold upon reality failed, he must have been dropped back out of the dissolving folds upon the spot where the tree had stood in the space-circled world, through that vanished world floor into the spot he had been snatched from in the instant of the dim land's dissolution. It must have happened after the terrible force of the explosion had spent itself,
before Thag dared move even himself through the walls of changing energy into his own far land again. Smith sighed and lifted a hand to his throbbing head, rising slowly to his feet. What time had elapsed he could not guess, but he must assume that the patrol still searched for him. Wearily he set out across the circle of havoc toward the nearest shelter which Ilar offered. The dust rose in ghostly moonlit clouds under his feet.
The end. Do you want to know how you can help save more of the forgotten stories of futures past? Visit storiesoffuturespast.substack.com/about.